Royal weddings love drama, and sometimes that drama started before anyone even said "I do." From collapsing decorations to dead animals falling from the sky, yes really. Explore the superstitions, signs and bizarre omens that terrified entire courts. Nothing says pure eternal love like the church roof leaking directly on the bride. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. A royal wedding was never just a wedding. It was the social Olympics, the medieval version of a televised red carpet event, minus the cameras but with double the anxiety and triple the superstition. Before the bride even stepped into her carriage, the entire court was already on edge, anxiously scanning the heavens, the ground, the animals, the weather, and occasionally the bride's facial expression to determine if the universe approved. And let's be honest, the universe often did not approve. In an age when people blamed everything from plagues to bad hair days on ominous forces, it's no surprise that royal marriages came with a long pre-ceremony checklist of signs that could doom the couple before the priest opened his mouth. Royal astrologers whispered warnings, court soothsayers made overly dramatic declarations, and noble women clutched rosaries like they were life preservers. If the sky looked slightly too cloudy, bad sign. If a candle flickered the wrong way, disaster looming. If someone sneezed at the wrong moment, pack it up. The marriage was practically cursed. And then there were the omens that really made people sweat. Animals, for example, were believed to be celestial telegrams from the beyond. A bird flying over the wedding procession was good luck, unless it was circling, or silent, or loud, or frankly doing anything other than politely minding its feathery business. Worse were the stories of birds falling from the sky mid-ceremony, which was interpreted as either nature expressing strong disapproval or the castle cat getting overly ambitious the night before. Imagine standing at the altar, nervously smoothing down your silk sleeves, only for a half-stunned pigeon to plop beside your expensive shoes. Nothing kills the romantic mood quite like airborne poultry making a surprise entrance. But animals weren't the only culprits. Buildings themselves seemed determined to deliver commentary. Royal wedding venues, cathedrals, chapels, giant stone structures had a remarkable habit of picking the perfect moment to misbehave. Bells cracked, altars wobbled, floorboards creaked like they were whispering warnings, and on more than one occasion, parts of the church roof simply gave up. Nothing says pure eternal love like the church roof leaking directly on the bride, historians would later quip. But at the time, the guests did not laugh. They gasped, whispered, crossed themselves, and cast increasingly worried glances at the couple. A dripping ceiling wasn't just a sign of poor medieval engineering. It was interpreted as heaven weeping at the union, or worse, heaven sweating from sheer stress at what was about to unfold. Many courts hired astrologers to ensure the planets aligned correctly before the vows. If the stars decided to be difficult, and they often did, the wedding was delayed, rescheduled, or held under duress, while half the royal court wondered whether Saturn's grumpy mood meant doom. Imagine explaining to hundreds of guests that the wedding would be postponed because an astrologer saw something deeply concerning in the position of Mars. It sounds ridiculous, but monarchs took this very seriously. After all, they weren't just marrying for love, or, let's be honest, not for love at all. They were marrying for alliances, treaties, heirs, and bragging rights. If Mars sabotaged the vibe, everything was at stake. Even the journey to the wedding was a minefield of superstition. A royal bride riding to her ceremony passed under banners, through cheering crowds around decorated streets, and through the ever-present threat of cosmic sabotage. If her carriage wheel wobbled, guests muttered. If a horse stumbled, people gasped. If her veil caught a breeze and lifted too dramatically, some old noblewoman inevitably clutched her pearls and declared, "This will end badly." It wasn't ideal. A bride couldn't sneeze without someone interpreting it as a celestial commentary. The most dramatic omens were, of course, the freak accidents. Decorations collapsing at the last second, torches going out simultaneously, choir boys fainting like synchronized performers. One European wedding famously saw the main altar candle extinguish itself 3 times in a row, a sign so terrifying that the bride reportedly asked her ladies-in-waiting if she was allowed to walk briskly in the opposite direction. Sadly, she was not, and yet despite the panic, the whispering, the sweating nobles, and the heavens throwing shade in real time, the ceremony always marched on. Royal duty demanded it. The bride smiled, the groom pretended not to notice the ominous thunder, and the priest pressed forward with all the enthusiasm of a man praying his building didn't collapse mid-vow. By the time the couple finally exchanged rings, everyone was breathing a sigh of relief, not because they had witnessed a moment of sacred unity, but because no more omens could ruin the day. Well, almost none. The wedding night had its own omens, traditions, political observers, and potential disasters, but that is another chapter entirely. For now, the takeaway is simple. Royal weddings didn't begin with romance. They began with anxiety, superstition, and a desperate hope that the walls, weather, and wildlife would behave for just a few hours. Spoiler, they rarely did. Why royal weddings were political hostage situations disguised as celebrations. Explore feuding nobles forced to behave, foreign ambassadors glaring over canapes, and grudges older than the castle itself. Imagine seating your ex-enemy across from your future in-law and praying they don't duel with soup spoons. If you've ever struggled with a wedding guest list, deciding who to invite, who will cause drama, and who will show up purely for the free food, congratulations, you share a spiritual bond with royal wedding planners across history. Except the stakes back then were slightly higher. A modern wedding might descend into drama if an ex shows up uninvited. A royal wedding, however, could spiral into international crisis if Uncle Ferdinand sneezed in the general direction of the ambassador from France. And yet these events were supposed to symbolize unity. If unity means trapping centuries of generational hatred in a room filled with alcohol and pointy cutlery, then yes, unity was absolutely achieved. Royal weddings were political hostage situations disguised as parties. Imagine a grand hall full of feuding nobles forced to smile, pretend to like each other, and not commit treason before dessert. The guest list wasn't simply a list. It was a strategy, a battlefield layout, a careful balancing act requiring enough diplomacy to prevent the entire kingdom from imploding. Every name represented a fragile alliance. A rival claimed the throne, a family feud that had started when someone's ancestor punched someone else's ancestor in the year 1243. In short, these weddings made holiday gatherings look peaceful. Let's begin with the nobles. These people were natural drama magnets. They came armed with gossip, old resentments, political agendas, and the emotional stability of wet parchment. Many had fought each other in wars, stolen each other's land, or married each other's siblings against their will, and now they were expected to gather in a church, smile politely, and clap at the appropriate moments. Good luck. A noble who had spent years plotting revenge was suddenly instructed to stand near the man who once tried to poison him, hold a cup of wine, and act like the picture of friendliness. If you're wondering how many nobles actually succeeded in behaving, the answer is almost none. Even seating them was a nightmare. Medieval and early modern courts obsessed over seating precedents. Who sat closest to the king, who sat at the high table, who was stuck near the drafty door because they weren't important enough to be warm. Every placement sent a message. Seat someone too low, and they'd take it as an insult. Seat someone too high, and another noble would assume you were plotting to undermine them. Royal seating charts created more tears, threats, and whispered arguments than the actual vows, and the pressure was immense. Imagine seating your ex-enemy across from your future in-law and praying they don't duel with soup spoons. That wasn't a joke. That was a workplace hazard. Foreign ambassadors were even worse. They attended royal weddings for one primary reason: to stare across the banquet hall, and silently remind everyone that their country still existed and still expected tribute. These ambassadors didn't mingle so much as lurk. They came in groups, wore suspiciously fancy clothing to assert dominance, and stood in intimidating clusters near the wine table. Their mission was simple: appear dignified, observe political rivals, and judge every detail of the ceremony. Did the bride's outfit seem too French? Did the groom bow too deeply to the Spanish envoy? Did the toasts include enough flattering references to the Holy Roman Empire? If even one ambassador raised an eyebrow, someone back home would write a letter claiming diplomatic outrage. These ambassadors also brought their own rivalries. Imagine stuffing centuries of France-England tension, Holy Roman Empire drama, and Ottoman-Venetian hostility into one stone hall, and hoping the musicians played loud enough to drown out the political mumbling. Some ambassadors used weddings as passive-aggressive performance art. They refused to clap, refused to bow, or refused to eat the food, claiming it was an insult to their cuisine. Nothing says international friendship like glaring at someone while holding a half-eaten pastry. And let's not forget the royal relatives. Every monarchy had multiple branches of family trees that twisted, tangled, and occasionally tried to strangle each other. Cousins who hated each other, uncles who believed they should be king, and widowed dowagers who held enough political influence to make everyone nervous. These relatives attended the wedding not to celebrate, but to examine, critique, and whisper judgments behind embroidered fans. Weddings became arenas where royal relatives surveyed each other, like predators meeting at a watering hole. Some dramas were almost comically petty. Guests fought over who got to carry the bride's train, who escorted her to the altar, or who was allowed to stand closest to the ceremonial cake. Something as simple as a misplaced bow or an incorrectly tied sash could spark a heated argument that lasted decades. If a noblewoman's outfit was slightly more elaborate than the bride's, whispers flew. If someone's hat blocked someone else's view, scandal erupted. These people could turn anything into a diplomatic crisis, and beneath this chaos was one universal truth: everyone was watching everyone else. A royal wedding wasn't a celebration, it was surveillance. Who toasted too quickly? Who laughed too loudly? Who arrived late and pretended it was intentional? Every action was interpreted as a political message. If two nobles spent too long talking, people assumed they were plotting. If ambassadors stood apart, the court worried about war. If a relative smiled too brightly at the groom, rumours spread faster than the wine. So while the bride and groom stood at the altar trying to look radiant and regal, the court behind them was quietly boiling with tension. Ancient grudges simmered. Political rivals eyed each other suspiciously. Foreign envoys silently measured the kingdom's strength based on tablecloth quality. It was a miracle these events didn't end with fistfights, poison tasting, or the castle collapsing under the pressure of collective passive aggression. In the end, the cursed guest list made royal weddings less about love and more about survival. The real triumph wasn't the vows, it was getting through the day without sparking a rebellion. Yes, several royal grooms simply didn't arrive. From last-minute panic to intentional ghosting, this chapter covers the princes who fled rather than wed. He loved her with all his heart, just not enough to physically be there. A royal groom skipping his own wedding sounds like something that would only happen in a romantic comedy starring someone with great hair and poor decision-making skills. But history, with its impeccable sense of drama, beat Hollywood to the idea centuries ago. Long before runaway brides became a cinematic trope, runaway grooms were quietly causing international incidents, scandalizing entire courts, and giving royal wedding planners chronic migraines. After all, weddings back then weren't simply personal milestones, they were political treaties with pastry courses. Missing a wedding didn't just hurt the bride's feelings, it shook kingdoms. Let's begin with the sheer audacity of the situation. A prince, raised to embody honour and duty, was expected to show up, say his lines, and unite two powerful families. And yet, more than one royal groom took a long look at his future obligations, panicked internally, and decided the most honourable thing to do was sprint in the opposite direction. He loved her with all his heart, just not enough to physically be there. Sometimes the absences were rooted in fear of responsibility, fear of political fallout, fear of marrying someone they'd never met, or fear of marrying someone they had met. Imagine being a prince who sees his bride for the first time and suddenly realizes his lifetime alliance is starting to look like a life sentence. History records several grooms who dramatically reconsidered their futures mere hours before the ceremony. Panic attacks weren't called panic attacks back then. They were called a sudden divine message urging me to disappear. One legendary example, never forgotten by gossip-loving courtiers, involved a groom who simply rode off into the countryside on the morning of his wedding, claiming he needed air. What he apparently needed was a location where no one could ask him to recite vows. His disappearance triggered a search party, a diplomatic crisis, and at least 3 nobles fainting for theatrical effect. When the prince was finally found, hiding in a mill house and muttering about destiny, the court's official explanation was that he'd gone on a spiritual retreat. Translation: the groom ran away and the kingdom couldn't handle the PR disaster. Other grooms skipped weddings for entirely political reasons. Some marriages were arranged without their consent, designed purely to benefit ambitious parents or scheming advisors. A few princes rebelled the only way young royals could, by refusing to show up. It wasn't exactly subtle, but it was undeniably effective. A missing groom sent a strong message: I do not support this marriage, this treaty, or the monstrous feathered hat I'm being forced to wear. Then there were the grooms whose absence wasn't dramatic, but simply logistical. Communication wasn't great in centuries past, and travel was always at the mercy of weather, disease, and poor road conditions. A groom attempting to arrive from another kingdom might find himself trapped in snow, bogged down in mud, detained at a border, or delayed by an ambassador who wanted to chat about tariffs for 6 unnecessary hours. While some of these delays were legitimate, others were suspiciously convenient. More than one prince developed a sudden illness, just in time for his wedding, the type of illness that cures itself the moment the pressure subsides. One particularly infamous groom claimed to have food poisoning the night before his ceremony. Did he truly suffer, or did he perhaps just look at the royal wedding schedule, see 12 hours of formalities and decide his stomach couldn't emotionally handle it? Historians remain divided. Of course, royal courts had to invent creative excuses whenever a groom vanished. You couldn't simply announce to a room of powerful nobles and foreign dignitaries that the groom bailed. Absolutely not. Instead, elaborate explanations were fashioned on the spot. The prince is delayed. The prince has taken ill. The prince has been called to urgent state matters. In reality, the palace staff was usually whispering frantically, running through corridors, and sending frantic messages to anyone who might know where the groom had last been seen. Meanwhile, the poor bride had to stand there pretending everything was normal. Imagine wearing 40 pounds of brocade, sweating under candlelight, listening to a priest stall for time while courtiers exchanged terrified glances. The atmosphere must have been thick with awkwardness, and the faint sound of someone sobbing into a lace handkerchief. When the groom truly never returned, things became even worse. Treaties collapsed, families raged, ambassadors wrote extremely dramatic letters home. In one case, the bride's family reportedly threatened war, not because they disliked the groom, but because they disliked being insulted. Royal pride was a delicate thing. Nothing bruised it quite like being stood up in front of Europe. But despite all the chaos, runaway grooms did occasionally get sympathy. Some were seen as tragic figures trapped in political machinery. Others were admired for refusing to bend to dynastic pressure. In rare cases, history even shows that these rebellious princes were celebrated for choosing personal freedom over enforced marital diplomacy. Whether they fled in fear, protested political manipulation, or simply got lost on the road, one truth remains universal. Royal grooms didn't always show up, and when they didn't, the entire wedding became a historical spectacle of shock, embarrassment, and frantic damage control. A modern groom might leave a bride at the altar and generate gossip. A royal groom did it and generated international tension, diplomatic fury, panicked scribes, and one very unhappy king. mistaken identity weddings, political swaps, veiled stand-ins, and one bride who was discovered only minutes before the ceremony to be someone completely different. Surprise, your marriage begins with a plot twist. Royal weddings were supposed to symbolize stability, continuity, and carefully choreographed political harmony. Yet every so often, history decided to take that script, fling it out the nearest turret window, and throw the court into pure matrimonial chaos. Today, if someone accidentally marries the wrong person, it becomes a reality show. In the past, it became a diplomatic disaster, a family scandal, and a historical footnote titled something like, "That time the groom married a stranger in front of everyone." Yes, mistaken bride weddings happened, and when they happened in royal courts, they were less romantic comedy and more state-level catastrophe. Let's begin with the core absurdity. Sometimes the bride at the altar was not the bride the groom expected. Royal marriages often involved carefully controlled introductions, strict protocol, and elaborate veiling traditions. A veil today is a fashion accessory. Back then it was practically a security blanket. It covered the face, the hair, the hopes, the fears, and occasionally, when the situation required it, the identity of a woman who was absolutely not the intended bride. Surprise! Your marriage begins with a plot twist. One of the most dramatic types of swap involved political bait and switching. A princess promised in marriage might fall ill, die unexpectedly, or develop an unfortunate tendency to loudly insult foreign ambassadors. When this happened, her family sometimes had no choice but to stretch the truth like medieval taffy. They would quietly replace her with a sister, cousin, lady-in-waiting, or distant relative who roughly resembled the original bride, or at least resembled a person who could plausibly stand in a dimly lit church without raising suspicion. Royal families were desperate to avoid offending foreign courts, and sometimes deception seemed easier than diplomacy. One legendary mishap involved a royal stand-in who was chosen purely because she had the same hairstyle as the actual princess. The plan was simple: veil her heavily, keep the lighting dramatic, and hope the groom had forgotten what the original bride looked like. Unfortunately, the stand-in was several inches taller, had a very distinctive laugh, and tripped during the procession directly onto the king's brother. By the time the groom finally saw her face, the priest had already reached the forever and ever portion of the vows. Too late, treaty sealed, love optional. But mistaken identity didn't always require political scheming. Sometimes it was the result of sheer confusion. Royal weddings were crowded, chaotic, and full of women wearing identical layers of brocade, jewels, lace, and veils thick enough to double as portable fog banks. A bride could easily become lost in the crowd. In one case, a nervous bride accidentally stood in the wrong waiting chamber, while another noble woman, who was not supposed to be anywhere near the altar, wandered into place at precisely the wrong moment. The groom, apparently overwhelmed and not paying close attention, took her hand and walked confidently toward the altar. By the time someone shouted, "That's not her," the choir had already started the hymn. And then there were the deliberate stand-ins. Sometimes royalty used proxy brides, a political representative who symbolically married the groom on behalf of the actual bride who was miles away. But sometimes this symbolic gesture was mixed up with real-life ceremony logistics. Confusion between proxy brides and actual brides led to several historic moments in which the groom genuinely thought he was marrying one woman, while the kingdom insisted he'd already married another by proxy weeks earlier. Nothing like waking up from your wedding feast and being informed, "Actually, sire, your real wife is currently in Spain." Some of the most dramatic misidentifications happened just moments before the ceremony. One account tells of a noble woman who was preparing to attend the wedding as a guest, only to be mistaken for the bride because she happened to be wearing similar colours. Courtiers ushered her into the bride's procession, like a lost sheep returned to its pen. By the time she realised what was happening, she was already halfway down the aisle, surrounded by flower girls throwing petals like confetti-powered traitors. Meanwhile, the actual bride was trapped in a corridor because a guard refused to believe she was the bride. Bureaucracy has ruined many things. In this case, it nearly ruined a royal marriage. Of course, the fallout from these swaps was rarely peaceful. Grooms were outraged, brides felt humiliated, and ambassadors treated every mix-up as an opportunity to accuse someone, anyone, of plotting sabotage. And remember, royal marriages were tools of diplomacy. Marrying the wrong woman could void treaties, ignite territorial disputes, or create inheritance nightmares. Entire lines of succession became questionable because of a single badly lit chapel or a particularly unhelpful veil. In some cases, the groom tried to challenge the wedding after discovering the switch, but the church, which had spent hours preparing, chanting, and making sure no one fainted, often refused to unravel the marriage. "You said the vows," they insisted. "You held the hand, that is binding. Also, we are not doing this ceremony twice." Meanwhile, the swapped-in brides faced their own dilemmas. They were suddenly royal, suddenly politically significant, and suddenly married to a man who either didn't want them or had accidentally married them, like one might accidentally buy the wrong type of bread. Some adapted, using their surprise elevation to wield influence they never expected. Others quietly endured their new roles, wondering how their lives turned into a diplomatic farce. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is how common these identity mishaps were. Between veils, dim lighting, political panic, travel delays, and the occasional scheming monarch, royal weddings were practically designed to create confusion, and every time someone would whisper afterward, "Well, at least they're married, somehow." A modern wedding might suffer from a forgotten ring or a botched speech. A royal wedding suffered from the existential question, who did we just marry? Tight corsets, collapsing gowns, and jewels falling into ceremonial soup. How clothing disasters nearly ruined alliances. When your dress is so heavy, you need 2 ladies in waiting and a prayer just to walk. In the modern world, a wardrobe malfunction at a wedding becomes an embarrassing memory, maybe a funny anecdote. In royal history, however, a wardrobe malfunction could trigger full-blown panic, diplomatic tension, and at least 3 ambassadors writing audibly furious letters to their kings. Royal wedding clothing wasn't just fabric, it was symbolism, wealth, political messaging, and centuries of expectation stitched together by tired seamstresses who were probably praying nothing ripped under candlelight. And yet things ripped. A lot. Royal brides walked into their ceremonies wrapped in layers of silk, velvet, brocade, embroidery, jewels, and a concerning amount of hope. When your dress is so heavy you need 2 ladies in waiting and a prayer just to walk, you know you're wearing something less like a gown and more like a portable architectural structure. Some dresses weighed so much that the bride essentially moved like a politely rolling boulder, unable to bend, lean, or breathe without assistance. No wonder things went wrong. Let's begin with the famously over-engineered gowns. Royal seamstresses were under immense pressure to create garments that reflected grandeur, wealth, divine blessing, and political strength, all while holding together during a ceremony that could last hours. But no matter how impressive the craftsmanship, there was always the possibility that the gown would rebel. Stitches snapped, panels sagged, hoops collapsed like failed bridges. One bride's gown was so structurally complex that when she attempted her first step down the aisle, the entire skirt shifted sideways, pulling her with it like an overly enthusiastic dance partner. It took 2 ladies in waiting, 1 priest, and a very confused flower girl to set her right. Then there were the corsets. Royal brides often wore corsets tight enough to compress emotions, organs, and the will to live. These corsets were laced by women who believed deeply in the philosophy of, if she's still conscious, we can go tighter. The unfortunate result? Brides fainting mid-procession, brides gasping like decorative fish, brides unable to bow or kneel during the ceremony, and brides who upon attempting to sit during the feast discovered they could not physically fold at the waist. In one case, a bride's corset was laced so tightly that a jewelled button shot off the bodice with alarming velocity and embedded itself into a ceremonial tapestry. The tapestry survived. The bride's dignity did not. Jewellery was no safer. Royals insisted on wearing enough jewels to blind their guests and strain their necks, and these jewels had a distressing tendency to detach themselves at the worst possible moment. Imagine a solemn, echoing cathedral. The bride steps forward, and suddenly clink. A priceless ruby falls off her necklace and rolls across the floor like a guilty marble fleeing the scene of a crime. Worse was the infamous case of a jewel plopping directly into a ceremonial bowl of broth during the wedding banquet. The guests watched in horrified silence as a pearl bobbed to the surface like a tiny, expensive dumpling. Elaborate headdresses caused equal chaos. Crowns slipped, tiaras wobbled, veils got caught on pillars, candle stands, decorative statues, and once, unfortunately, on the groom. When a bride turned her head too quickly, her veil snagged on a torch bracket and nearly yanked her backwards, turning the solemn ceremony into what looked like a physical comedy routine. But clothing malfunctions didn't just cause laughter, they triggered political tension. In the royal world, symbolism mattered. If a bride's gown tore, some guests interpreted it as a sign of bad luck. Foreign ambassadors interpreted it as a sign of disrespect. Nobles interpreted it as a sign that someone, surely someone, must have done this intentionally. A ripped sleeve could set off whispers of sabotage. A fallen jewel could spark rumours that the bride's family couldn't afford better craftsmanship, and God forbid the groom's outfit malfunctioned. A loose buckle on a royal sword belt once caused a diplomatic panic because guests assumed the groom had lost his courage at the altar. In reality, the leather was simply old. Colour choice could also create fashion disasters. Dyes were expensive and unstable. A bride wearing a rare shade of purple might find the dye running when she sweated, leaving streaks that made her look like she'd been aggressively hugged by a grape. Another bride's gown changed colour in patches under the heat of hundreds of candles, turning her into a living, blinking mood ring. Foreign dignitaries, perplexed and alarmed, debated whether the shifting colours were a coded message about political alliances. They were not. It was just the dye revolting. Even footwear betrayed brides. Royal shoes were often made for beauty, not functionality. Brides tripped, slipped, and skidded their way down aisles that were polished enough to qualify as ice rinks. One particularly unfortunate queen slid nearly 2 meters during her grand entrance, saved only by a particularly quick-thinking maid who grabbed her like a falling sack of flour. And yet, no matter how chaotic the wardrobe disasters became, the show always continued. Someone tugged the gown back into structure. Someone retrieved the runaway jewels. Someone repinned the slipping crown with enough force to anchor a ship. Royal weddings were resilient, even when the outfits weren't. By the end of the day, every bride who survived her ceremony, fabric intact or not, deserved a medal. Or at least a dress made from something lighter than 10 kilograms of embroidered symbolism. Royal weddings were expensive, and some kings spent like drunken magpies. Explore the weddings that drained treasuries, angered taxpayers, and sent kingdoms spiralling into debt. Congratulations, you're married. Also, your country is broke. If modern weddings can empty bank accounts with alarming speed, royal weddings historically emptied kingdoms. A royal ceremony wasn't just a celebration, it was a public declaration of wealth, power, and occasionally profound fiscal irresponsibility. Monarchs wanted their weddings to be the loudest, brightest, most jewelled spectacle the world had ever seen, even if it meant pawning half the royal silverware, quietly hoping peasants didn't riot after seeing next year's taxes. Some kings spent like drunken magpies, attracted to anything shiny, glittery, or remotely expensive, and governments paid for it quite literally. In many eras, the cost of a royal wedding wasn't measured in coins but in consequences. Lavish ceremonies could destabilise entire governments, stall military campaigns, cause food shortages, or plunge kingdoms into decades of debt. Yet kings marched forward undeterred, determined to outshine every wedding that came before and every wedding their rivals might possibly plan in the future. The mentality was simple. If another kingdom had served a 20-course banquet, they would serve a 40-course one. If a neighbouring king had gifted their bride a diamond the size of a walnut, they would produce one the size of a plum. It was an arms race of glitter. Let's begin with the architecture. Some kings insisted on building entirely new palaces or halls just for their wedding day, a level of commitment modern couples only experience when repainting their guest bathroom. These construction projects required thousands of workers, endless supplies, and budgets that ballooned faster than a stressed court accountant's blood pressure. One monarch famously ordered a temporary ceremonial hall made entirely of imported wood, silk, gold leaf, and what might generously be described as optimism. The hall was breathtaking. The invoice was catastrophic. Historians believe the building was used exactly once before it quietly collapsed under its own financial symbolism. Food was another financial black hole. Royal banquets weren't simple gatherings. They were culinary marathons designed to prove a kingdom's prosperity. Tables groaned under mountains of meat. Platters of rare birds, exotic fruits shipped across oceans, and elaborate sugar sculptures that cost more than entire villages. Some kings insisted on serving animals that were so rare or difficult to prepare that the kitchen staff spent weeks panicking. One wedding famously included a dish that required 20 chefs, a specially constructed oven, and a cookbook written by a man who claimed to have spoken directly with God about seasoning. The taste was reportedly fine. The bill was ruinous. Entertainment devoured yet another chunk of the treasury. Monarchs hired musicians, dancers, poets, acrobats, jesters, fire-breathers, falconers, sword performers, and troops of actors who travelled from far-flung corners of the world. One king paid an entire ship's worth of gold for an Italian troupe known for performing scenes that involved floating platforms and dangerous amounts of confetti. Another hired a mechanical engineer to create an animatronic swan that glided around the banquet hall spouting poetry. It malfunctioned halfway through the event and recited the same line for 45 minutes. Guests pretended to find this charming, while privately praying the machine would combust. Gifts also drained treasuries. Royal gifts weren't optional, they were critical political statements. The groom was expected to produce jewels, land grants, elaborate clothing and symbolic treasures. Some princes, eager to impress, gave away estates so valuable that tax collectors fainted upon hearing the news. Others ordered custom-made items, gold-embroidered saddles, carved ivory cabinets, pearl-encrusted crowns, or ceremonial swords encrusted so thickly with gems they were completely unusable. One king even gifted his bride a pet lion, a gesture that cost a fortune in handlers, food and repairs after the lion decided it did not enjoy indoor life. Decorations were yet another fiscal abyss. Entire forests were felled to produce banners and platforms. Florists imported blooms from foreign climates. Walls were draped in tapestries that represented mythological scenes no one fully understood. Lighting was provided by thousands of candles, each made from pricey, perfumed wax that melted faster than the kingdom's credit. One wedding used so many candles that the cathedral's interior temperature rose to uncomfortable levels, causing guests to sweat through their brocade while silently blaming the king's flamboyant taste. And then there was the problem of scale. Royal weddings weren't intimate affairs. They were city-wide events attended by thousands of nobles, officials, soldiers, diplomats, relatives, minor aristocrats, and anyone who could reasonably claim to be important. Feeding these people, housing them, and ensuring they didn't cause trouble was a monumental logistical challenge. Cities expanded marketplaces, paved new roads, and built temporary bridges, all on the royal dime. The financial strain lingered long after the confetti settled. Of course, someone had to foot the bill. Spoiler, it was never the king. The cost fell on taxpayers, peasants, merchants, or anyone unfortunate enough to live within the kingdom's borders. After an especially extravagant wedding, citizens often found themselves facing new levies, double duties, or temporary taxes that outlived multiple monarchs. Congratulations, you're married. Also, your country is broke. Sometimes the financial fallout was immediate. One kingdom spent so much on a wedding feast that it couldn't pay its soldiers for months, leading to an armed mutiny politely known in official records as a misunderstanding involving pointy objects. Another kingdom drained its treasury so thoroughly that the next year's harvest festival was cancelled, replaced by a much less festive gathering titled Mandatory Grain Redistribution Day. Yet for all their financial irresponsibility, kings simply couldn't resist the allure of grandeur. To them, a wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a moment to display wealth, intimidate rivals, impress allies, and reinforce the monarchy's image. If the kingdom's budget collapsed under the weight of 10,000 imported candles, so be it, the wedding had sparkled. And long after the feasts were eaten, the jewels were locked away, and the decorations were dismantled, the kingdom remained saddled with the bill, a lasting reminder that love may be priceless, but royal weddings definitely weren't. Burned peacock, undercooked boar, exploding pies and drunken cooks, royal banquet disasters that turned feasts into survival challenges. When the royal chef's motto was basically, if it doesn't poison you, it counts as a win. If you've ever attended a wedding where the chicken tasted suspiciously like rubber or the cake leaned dangerously to one side, to spare a thought for the poor souls who attended royal weddings centuries ago, modern catering disasters are irritating. Royal catering disasters were legendary. In fact, they were so dramatic, so chaotic, and so frequently life-threatening that one wonders whether royal chefs secretly hated everyone in attendance. When the royal chef's motto was basically, if it doesn't poison you, it counts as a win, you're sitting at the type of banquet that turns dining into gambling with the destiny. Royal wedding feasts were spectacles. Huge, crowded, loud, and dominated by food that was meant to symbolize wealth and power, even if it tasted like regret. The host kingdom needed to impress visiting nobles, foreign ambassadors, rival monarchs, and anyone with enough wealth to spread gossip afterward. Meals had to be lavish, theatrical, and preferably edible. 2 out of 3 was considered a success. Start with the centerpiece dishes. A royal wedding banquet often featured animals displayed with more showmanship than a circus act. Peacocks roasted and then refeathered to appear alive. Boars that required entire teams of chefs to maneuver. Swan sculptures made of pastry. Some dishes were so elaborate that even the cooks weren't entirely sure how they were supposed to be eaten. It was food as performance, dinner theatre where the food was both the main attraction and the primary hazard. Burned peacock was one of the most notorious disasters. Peacock was considered a noble dish, but it was extremely difficult to cook. Overcook it and it tasted like scorched anxiety. Undercook it and guests risked gastrointestinal torment. One infamous feast featured a peacock so burned that its feathers, meant to be reattached for dramatic flair, crumbled into sad, crispy fragments. The bird was presented anyway, because when you've spent 3 hours preparing something, you're not about to admit defeat. Guests politely poked it with their knives while trying not to cough on the smoke rising from its surface. Undercooked boar was another common catastrophe. Boar meat needs thorough cooking, but wedding kitchens were chaotic places where timing was more theoretical than practical. One royal wedding became infamous because the first slice into the grand boar unleashed a fountain of pink juices that made half the table go pale. The groom reportedly leaned over to whisper to the bride, "At least the wine is cooked," which did not help. Then there were the pies. Grand pies. Monumental pies. Pies big enough to conceal birds, musicians, or small entertainers depending on the century. These pies were supposed to be stunning surprises, until they weren't. One wedding's surprise pie exploded because the internal steam pressure built up too much. The crust burst open like an edible volcano, launching bits of meat, gravy, and decorative flowers across the high table. An ambassador was hit squarely in the face by a piece of unexpectedly airborne pastry. He interpreted this as a political insult, because of course he did. Another pie was meant to release a flock of doves, symbolizing peace, when cut open. Instead, the birds panicked, flew into candelabras, and nearly set the drapes on fire. Nothing says romantic union, like the smell of singed upholstery and the sound of guests screaming while flapping birds ricochet off chandeliers. But pies weren't the only dangerously unpredictable foods. Sugar sculptures, a royal favourite, sometimes melted under the heat of hundreds of candles. More than one elaborate sugar castle collapsed mid-banquet, sending sugar towers cascading onto the tablecloth like a sugary reenactment of a tragic battle. And then we get to the cooks themselves, heroes, villains, and victims of a kitchen filled with boiling pots, screaming assistants, unpredictable ovens, and the constant threat of royal judgment. Some cooks handled this pressure admirably, others coped by drinking. Drunken cooks were practically a historical tradition. One record mentions a chef who had fortified himself with spirits to manage the stress of preparing a 30-dish feast. He ended up seasoning the wrong dishes, dropping an entire tray of roasted quail and loudly accusing a pastry apprentice of being a spy from another kingdom. Another drunken kitchen disaster involved a chef who forgot that he had placed 24 pheasants in a secondary oven. By the time he remembered, they had transformed into charcoal sculptures. Rather than admit the mistake, he had the kitchen staff smother the birds in sauce and hope no one noticed. People noticed. Of course, food safety was not a thing. Meat sat out for questionable amounts of time. Seafood was transported inland without refrigeration. Milk products were used at temperatures that made monks clutch their rosaries. Guests learned to approach the buffet table with cautious optimism and a silent prayer. Surviving a royal wedding feast was considered a triumph of both the digestive system and the soul. And let's talk about the serving logistics. Courses arrived late, cold or out of order. Some dishes were served twice, some not at all. Servants collided while carrying trays. Once, a server tripped and sent a full platter of glazed hair sliding across the table like an escaped curling stone, eventually landing in the lap of a duchess who did not take it gracefully. Yet through all this chaos, royal wedding banquets continued because they served a purpose. They displayed wealth, overwhelmed guests with abundance, and created stories people would repeat for decades. Sure, the food might have been smoky, raw, explosive, or mildly hazardous, but it was memorable. And in royal politics, being memorable mattered almost as much as being alive after dessert. Blizzards, heatwaves, floods, storms. Some royal weddings happened in the weather conditions better suited for heroic sagas than marriage ceremonies. Because nothing says romance like your carriage sinking in a puddle the size of France. Royal weddings were supposed to be symbols of order, divine favour, and majestic serenity. Unfortunately, the weather never signed that contract. Nature often crashed the party with the enthusiasm of a toddler hopped up on honey cakes. Blizzards buried processions, heat waves roasted guests alive in layers of brocade, storms drowned entire courtyards. And wind gusts tried, quite literally, to carry brides away. If medieval ballads sound dramatic, it's because half of them were describing wedding ceremonies that Mother Nature personally attempted to cancel. Because nothing says romance like your carriage sinking in a puddle the size of France. Let's begin with the most theatrical threat: storms. Royal weddings were magnets for rain. It didn't matter how cloudless the previous week had been. Come ceremony day, the heavens declared, let chaos begin. One king's wedding procession was interrupted by a storm so violent that guests claimed they saw lightning strike the ceremonial archway moments after the groom passed beneath it. The bride later described feeling a sudden spiritual chill, though it might have been the fact that her gown now weighed 20 pounds more from the rain. Thunderstorms also played havoc with outdoor celebrations. Royal gardens became muddy battlegrounds where nobles slipped, slid and staggered to, with all the grace of startled cattle. One famously pompous duke fell into a fountain because a gust of wind shoved him, or, as some accounts dramatically phrased it, because the gods expressed disapproval at his attitude. The only thing bruised was his pride, but the scandal lasted weeks. Then there were the winds. Gusts had an uncanny talent for appearing at the exact moment a bride stepped out of her carriage, sweeping veils sideways, flipping cloaks over faces, and occasionally lifting skirts to heights unsuitable for royal dignity. One wedding saw a gust so powerful it blew half the floral decorations into the crowd, leaving noble women shielding themselves behind fans as petals assaulted them from every angle. The wind also tore banners from their poles, sending them snapping dramatically like battle standards. Foreign ambassadors, convinced the enemy kingdom was making a statement, immediately started whispering. Blizzards were even more spectacular. Winter weddings should have been romantic, snow-touched affairs, but royal weddings rarely get that lucky. Instead, blizzards ambushed guests, trapped carriages, froze musicians' fingers, and turned cathedral steps into accidental ice slides. One royal groom insisted on arriving by horseback despite the snow, and his horse, an intelligent creature with excellent survival instincts, refused to move until bribed with 3 apples and a frustrated prayer. By the time the wedding began, half the guests were drenched, the choir was shivering, and the groom's mustache had frozen into what historians generously call a rigid crystalline structure. And don't underestimate the heat. Summer weddings could be just as deadly. Medieval and early modern clothing was designed to trap heat with terrifying efficiency. Guests melted under the sun, sweating into layers of velvet, brocade, and ceremonial padding that made them resemble slow-cooking casseroles. One wedding ended with half the guests fainting from heat exhaustion, including a bishop whose collapse toppled 3 choir boys and a lectern. Heat waves also created unique horrors, melted wax dripping onto guests, wine turning tart in real time, and makeup smearing into what one poet described as a sorrowful watercolour of noble faces. Floods, too, played a starring role in royal wedding disasters. A sudden downpour could turn castle courtyards into waist-deep swamps. Carriages became stuck in mud pits so deep attendants had to physically lift them out, while the horses glared resentfully. One queen almost had to be carried into her ceremony because her carriage wheels sank into a puddle so enormous it might have been planning to become a lake. Streets overflowed, cloaks dragged through filthy water, and guests entered the cathedral looking like they had survived a minor seafaring expedition rather than a carriage ride. At another wedding, the river beside the palace swelled unexpectedly, and water poured into the reception hall, forcing guests to dance in ankle-deep water. Courtiers called it an improvised aquatic spectacle, but everyone else just called it wet and humiliating. Fog was another villain. Thick, impenetrable fog could swallow entire processions, leaving guests wandering around the palace grounds like confused ghosts searching for the kitchen. At one wedding, the fog was so dense that the bride's carriage arrived at the wrong entrance, leading her directly into the servants' hall, where several cooks screamed because they thought they had been visited by an apparition in pearls. Hailstorms also targeted royal weddings with uncanny precision. Hailstones the size of walnuts once rained down on a wedding parade, forcing guests to sprint for cover while holding up ceremonial objects as makeshift shields. Another hailstorm cracked several stained glass windows in the church, causing priests to interpret it as an extremely unsubtle message from above. But perhaps the most unforgettable weather disaster involved a wedding held during a monstrous windstorm. As the ceremony ended, a mighty gust blew open the cathedral doors with such force that several candles went out. Tapestries flapped violently, and the bride's train flew upward like a sail catching wind. The groom, trying to help, stepped on the hem accidentally, ripping the gown halfway up the back. Guests politely pretended they saw nothing, while court artists later depicted as a moment of divine revelation, which was certainly one way to frame it. Despite all this, royal weddings trudged forward. Monarchs couldn't reschedule for better weather, not when ambassadors had travelled weeks to attend, or entire towns had already been forced to rehearse their cheers, so they endured. Brides wrung out their dresses, grooms pretended they weren't freezing, guests accepted wet boots, melted wigs, and wind-blown dignity, and afterwards everyone agreed on one thing: the weather had made the wedding unforgettable. Disastrously unforgettable, yes. But in royal politics, a memorable event was sometimes as valuable as a smooth one. Some royal weddings were so long that guests fainted, priests lost their voices, and children aged emotionally. At hour 3, guests wondered if the ceremony was a wedding or an endurance trial. Royal weddings were many things: lavish, chaotic, glamorous, politically loaded. But above all, they were long, not normal person long, not your cousin's vows were a bit lengthy long. We are talking ceremonies so drawn out they could have been measured with a sundial. Ceremonies that required stamina, hydration, emotional fortitude, and the spiritual resilience of a medieval monk. At hour 3, guests wondered if the ceremony was a wedding or an endurance trial. Modern weddings may drag when someone insists on reading a 14-page poem, but royal ceremonies historically could stretch across entire afternoons, spilling into evenings, and occasionally threatening to intrude on the next calendar day. And unlike today, guests couldn't discreetly check their phones, mentally escape, or pretend to enjoy the music. They had to stand or kneel in silence, wearing 20 pounds of ceremonial clothing, listening to priests, bishops, and monarchs chant, intone, bless, declare, and recite until everyone's will to live began to evaporate. The length wasn't accidental. Royal rituals were designed to impress, intimidate, and symbolize the eternal nature of dynastic alliances. The thinking seemed to be, if the ceremony feels like it will never end, surely the marriage also will not end. Unfortunately, while symbolic, this approach had the side effect of creating weddings where guests prayed, not for marital success, but for a merciful conclusion. Let's begin with the opening procession. Royal couples didn't simply walk down the aisle. They were escorted with layers of ceremony. Heralds blowing trumpets, courtiers walking in elaborate formation, noble families processing by rank, guards marching with polished weapons, and attendants carrying symbolic objects no one fully understood. By the time the bride appeared, the guests had already been standing for so long their knees were filing complaints. Then came the blessings, multiple blessings, all the blessings. Every important religious figure needed a moment, and none of them were brief. Each one gave speeches, chanted verses, offered symbolic gestures, and occasionally added commentary about the duties of marriage. Guests got a crash course in theology whether they liked it or not. Some priests droned so steadily that guests swayed like trees in a gentle breeze, caught between boredom and unconsciousness. Children suffered the most. A small boy forced to attend a long royal wedding was likely to age 10 emotional years by the time the couple reached the ring exchange. Paintings of young attendants often show wide, haunted eyes, because these children had lived through things. They had heard entire sermons, they had endured hours of silence, they had carried candles heavier than their arms were prepared for. Many left the ceremony changed forever. The vows themselves were rarely quick. Royal couples exchanged not only personal vows but dynastic vows, promises that included the protection of lands, alliances with certain noble families, and obligations to heirs not yet born. These vows could stretch into long ritual sections, each one requiring a specific gesture, phrase, or bow. If the groom forgot his line, the priest repeated it. If the bride stumbled, the priest restarted the entire section. It was like a theatrical performance where no one dared improvise. And then there were the symbolic acts, exchanging rings, exchanging gifts, exchanging tokens representing fertility, prosperity, and political unity, lighting candles, sharing ceremonial wine, touching relics, receiving blessings from the senior nobles. Each ritual had its own slow, deliberate pace, and each one dragged the ceremony closer to the moment where someone in the audience whispered, "Are we still here? Is this still happening?" The heat inside grand cathedrals didn't help. Hundreds of candles burned, surrounded by bodies packed into stone walls with poor ventilation. Air became thick with incense, perfumes were heard in desperation. Guests fanned themselves with programs, sleeves, hands, anything that moved air. Every so often a noblewoman collapsed into her husband's arms in what can only be described as the most elegant faint possible. Servants developed a system. If someone fainted quietly, they dragged them out before anyone noticed. If someone fainted loudly, the ceremony paused while everyone politely pretended fainting was fashionable. Priests suffered too. Some lost their voices mid-ceremony, leaving them croaking through the final blessings, like exhausted frogs. One bishop famously whispered the last half of a ceremony because he simply did not have vocal strength left. Guests leaned forward, straining to hear, which in turn caused entire rows of nobles to tilt like dominoes. The final sections were the hardest. Guests, having survived 2 or 3 hours, believed the ordeal was ending, only to realize another ritual awaited. A final blessing, a final hymn, a final proclamation, a final symbolic gesture involving a crown, a sword, or a candle that everyone thought had already been used. Hope fluttered, then died. Some ceremonies dragged long enough that the daylight shifted noticeably, making it painfully clear that they had been trapped indoors for far too long. By the time the couple finally kissed, or in earlier eras simply touched foreheads, the audience experienced something close to spiritual transcendence. Not because of the romance, but because the ceremony was finally ending. Guests shuffled out of the cathedral with the speed of people escaping captivity. Knees buckled, ankles cracked. Servants revived fainted nobles. Children burst into tears of relief. And everyone silently vowed never to attend another wedding unless forced by royal decree. Ironically, despite their length, these ceremonies were remembered fondly in court gossip. People boasted about having survived them, like mountaineers bragging about summiting a dangerous peak. The absurd duration became a badge of honour. A royal wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a marathon wrapped in silk sanctity and ceremonial obligation. Everyone walked in hoping to witness romance. Everyone walked out grateful to still have functioning limbs, horses, dogs, falcons, elephants, and even cats causing absolute chaos. The royal horse arrived on time. Sadly, it was the only one who behaved. Royal weddings had a talent for attracting chaos, and nothing delivered chaos quite as reliably as animals. Animals were everywhere in royal life, symbols of majesty, wealth, military strength, hunting prestige, and occasionally diplomatic bragging rights. Naturally, they ended up at weddings too, not because they were needed, but because someone thought, you know what this ceremony could use? A giant animal with unpredictable instincts and no understanding of human social etiquette. Shockingly, things went wrong, very wrong. The royal horse arrived on time. Sadly, it was the only one who behaved. Let's start with the most common culprit. Horses. Horses were essential to royal pageantry, shining coats, braided manes, expensive saddles, more jewellery than some noble women. They were meant to embody grace and nobility, and to be fair, sometimes they did. But occasionally they behaved like animals who had spent the morning being polished, scented, adorned with ribbons, surrounded by trumpets, and then thrust into a screaming crowd of thousands. This did not always encourage calm. One infamous wedding procession turned into a 4-legged demolition derby when Startle Stallion spotted a flag flapping too enthusiastically in the wind. It reared, panicked, and set off a chain reaction of other horses also panicking because that's what horses do best. Courtiers were tossed into hedges. The groom's horse ran directly into a pastry vendor, creating a baked goods explosion so dramatic that some observers mistakenly thought it was part of the entertainment. Meanwhile, the bride's horse simply walked away from the scene, trotting toward a nearby orchard as if it had decided it was done with human nonsense for the day. Dogs, of course, were another problem. Royal courts loved their dogs. Hunting dogs, lap dogs, guard dogs, and dogs that were basically just furry accessories. Unfortunately, weddings were not designed with canine behaviour in mind. One wedding famously descended into barking chaos when a pair of royal greyhounds decided to chase each other through the ceremony, weaving between guest legs at the worst possible moments. The priest attempted to shout above the barking, but his voice cracked, and several guests misinterpreted his exasperated gestures as a new symbolic ritual. Another wedding suffered what historians politely call the Great Hound Intervention. A beloved royal mastiff, determined to follow the bride everywhere, attempted to climb onto the altar mid-vows. The bride, who adored the animal, tried to shoo it gently. The mastiff took this as an invitation to lick her face. The groom tried to intervene. The mastiff tried to lick him too. The priest dropped his holy text in horror. Guests clapped because they thought something charming was happening. It was not charming. Falcons were worse. Falcons were symbols of nobility and were often included in ceremonies perched on gloved hands. But falcons are, at their core, precision-guided chaos missiles. At one royal wedding, a falcon became excited by reflections from guests' jewellery and launched itself straight at a duchess who had the misfortune of wearing a particularly shiny necklace. Screaming ensued. The falcon swooped around the cathedral rafters, knocking loose a shower of dust onto the choir, and one tried to recapture it. The falcon responded by stealing their hat. This was not interpreted as a good omen. Cats, too, had their moment of glory, and one royal wedding morning was nearly ruined when the palace cat, a fluffy creature with a talent for mischief, leapt onto the bride's train just as she began walking down the aisle. This might have been salvageable if the cat had remained still. It did not. Instead, it clung to the fabric like a mountaineer scaling a cliffside. Every step the bride took caused the cat to slide slightly backward, extending its claws for dear life. Gasps, laughter, and at least one unplanned sneeze followed. The cat was eventually removed by a quick-thinking maid, though not before leaving a line of tiny claw marks in the gown that court artists later carefully omitted from their paintings. But perhaps no animals caused as much trouble as the exotic creatures imported solely for spectacle. Some weddings featured elephants, a grand, imposing symbol meant to impress foreign dignitaries. Elephants are majestic, intelligent, and powerful. They are also creatures who do not enjoy being dressed in embroidered cloth surrounded by trumpets or made to stand still in front of screaming crowds. One elephant, overwhelmed by noise, decided the best course of action was to back slowly into a fountain and refuse to leave, effectively blocking all guests from entering the banquet hall. Guests were forced to crawl over hedges and walls, while the elephant sat contentedly in its watery throne. Once, a royal family proudly displayed an exotic leopard as a symbol of their international prestige. The leopard, reacting as leopards often do when indoors against their will, escaped its handlers and took a leisurely stroll into the wedding feast. Guests panicked. Nobles climbed onto tables. Someone fainted directly into the trifle. The leopard, unimpressed, stole a roasted pheasant and walked back out. Peacocks, symbols of vanity and beauty, were also prone to misbehaviour. Their shrieks echoed beautifully through royal halls, except during wedding toasts, when the sudden sound made guests choke on their wine. One peacock strutted directly in front of the bride and groom during the ceremonial procession and refused to move, delaying the ceremony by 10 minutes while attendants tried to gently herd it away. The peacock hissed. The attendants fled. Eventually the bride stepped over it, an image recorded in later artwork as an elegant stride of grace, which was court code for she was annoyed. And then there were the pigeons, poor maligned pigeons. Sometimes they were used symbolically, released for peace and prosperity. Other times they released themselves, dropping gifts onto guests, decorations, and once disastrously into the groom's hair. The symbolism of that moment was heavily debated for years. Yet despite the chaos, animals remained staple characters in royal weddings. They brought life, symbolism, and occasionally danger. They created stories people retold for generations, and above all, they ensured that one universal truth remained intact. You can plan a wedding. You can organize a ceremony. You can script every moment. But animals? Animals do not care. They will ruin everything and somehow make the event unforgettable. Kings and queens who pre-gamed too hard, slurred through vows, or fell asleep mid-ceremony. Raise your glass, preferably not to your lips during the vows. If there is one universal truth in human history, it is this. Powerful people often make terrible decisions after a drink, and royal weddings, events already overflowing with emotion, anxiety, and thousands of spectators silently judging the table settings, were prime opportunities for spectacularly ill-timed intoxication. Some monarchs drank to calm their nerves, others drank to appear confident, and some drank because honestly, if you were about to be married in front of half the known world, You'd also consider the nearest goblet your closest emotional support object. Raise your glass, preferably not to your lips during the vows. Royal courts were no strangers to alcohol. Wine was safer than water. Ale was basically breakfast. Mead was dessert. Strong spirits were considered medicine, courage, and stress relief all in one. But even by royal standards, wedding day drinking could reach heroic extremes. There were kings who swaggered into their ceremonies red-cheeked and overly optimistic, queens who underestimated the strength of the wedding cordial, and princes who treated pre-ceremony drinks the way soldiers treat last meals. Let's begin with the royals who just had one drink too many before the ceremony. Some grooms, nervous about their vows, asked their attendants for a small sip of wine to steady their nerves. A tiny bit, barely anything. Except attendants were not known for resisting orders, and their definition of a small sip was often half a goblet of something that could set wood on fire. One groom became so emboldened by his liquid courage that he marched down the aisle swinging his arms like he was leading a parade. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. The bride bit her lip. The priest took a deep breath and whispered a prayer for strength. Other royals didn't wait until they reached the ceremony. They started drinking the night before. Bachelor feasts were notoriously excessive, and it wasn't uncommon for grooms to appear on their wedding morning looking like survivors of a mild battlefield skirmish. One prince showed up with such a powerful hangover that he demanded the priest speak softer, because the bells of heaven are smashing my skull. The bells, unfortunately, were real, loud, and mandatory. Then there were the royals who began drinking during the ceremony. Yes, during. One king, overwhelmed by the sheer length of his wedding ritual, discreetly signalled for wine between blessings. Servants, terrified to refuse, handed him tiny cups under the pretense of adjusting his ceremonial robes. By the halfway point of the ceremony, he was glassy-eyed and swaying, nodding far too enthusiastically at every mention of obedience and devotion. When asked to repeat his vows, he slurred the bride's name so badly that 2 translators were summoned in case this had somehow become a multilingual emergency. And we cannot forget the queen who pre-gamed her wedding breakfast with what she described as a little champagne to settle the stomach. Unfortunately, the palace kitchen misunderstood a little. Her walk down the aisle was graceful, but her vow delivery resembled a half-melodic, half-confused lullaby. Eyewitnesses claim nobody understood more than 3 words. The kingdom later insisted she had been overcome with emotion. Historians agree she was instead overcome with bubbles. Some royal newlyweds didn't even make it through the ceremony before alcohol betrayed them. One groom, sweating under his ceremonial robes, felt a potent cocktail of nerves and liquor bubbling within him. During a solemn pause, he hiccuped so loudly that the choir fell silent. Worse, the hiccup continued every 30 seconds, without The bride looked torn between concern and irritation. The bishop powered through, dodging hiccup bursts like an emotional minefield. The vow sounded like this: I, hic, take you, hic, as my lawful hic, O heavens, hic wife. In a different kingdom, a particularly enthusiastic queen toasted her marriage before the banquet even began. She raised her cup, downed it heroically, smiled brightly, and then promptly lost consciousness. Right there, mid-toast, noble women screamed. The groom panicked. The king blamed the wine. The wine blamed the king. She later awoke embarrassed but unharmed, and the event became so famously ridiculous that playwrights referenced it for decades. But perhaps the most entertaining mishaps came from royals who drank just enough to remain upright, but not enough to remain dignified. One king, during a long wedding procession, blew kisses at the crowd with the enthusiasm of a particularly affectionate street performer. His bride, mortified, whispered, "Stop that," which he interpreted as, "Do it more." Another bride, emboldened by a pre-ceremony drink, laughed through the entire coronation portion of her wedding and accidentally snorted during the priest's blessing. Several duchesses fainted from scandal. Her father pretended he hadn't heard it. Alcohol also created delightful problems at the wedding feasts. A freshly married prince once attempted to deliver a heartfelt toast, only to lose his train of thought halfway through and end the speech with, "to everything." Another monarch insisted on dancing after consuming far more wine than advisable. His dance involved waving his arms, stomping enthusiastically, and knocking over 2 candelabras. Guests applauded out of fear. And who could forget the royal groom who got so tipsy during the banquet that he mistook a high-ranking ambassador for a very decorative piece of furniture? He tried to rest his elbow on the man's shoulder as if it were a polished table. Tensions rose. War, thankfully, did not. Still, for all the embarrassment, drunk royals became legends. Their antics were whispered in palace corridors, retold at taverns, and secretly enjoyed by the very nobles who pretended to be offended. Sobriety might preserve dignity, but in royal memory, it is the tipsy monarchs who stay immortal. Because nothing adds flavour to a royal wedding quite like someone slurring through sacred vows while pretending everything is perfectly under control. When marriages designed to create peace instead triggered violence, rebellion, or international meltdown. Because nothing sets the mood like your wedding, causing 2 nations to scream at each other. Royal marriages were supposed to be elegant shortcuts to peace, neat little diplomatic knots tying kingdoms together through shared bloodlines, shared heirs, and shared in-laws who hopefully wouldn't try to kill each other. Unfortunately, history is littered with marriages that achieved the exact opposite. Instead of peace, they delivered war, rebellion, or continent-wide screaming matches, because nothing sets the mood like your wedding causing 2 nations to scream at each other. Think of it like this. Imagine planning a wedding specifically to calm down your feuding families. You pick a neutral location, a lovely ceremony, good food, and everyone promises to be civil, and then halfway through the vows, someone remembers that Uncle Richard stole Aunt Eleanor's goat in 1432, and suddenly fists are flying. Now replace the goat with land, power, and succession rights, and you have the royal version. Let's start with the simplest reason royal weddings ignited wars. Everyone wanted control. A princess marrying a foreign prince could suddenly shift the political balance of Europe, Asia, or wherever her kingdom happened to be sitting nervously on a map. Every marriage created winners and losers. Winners smiled, losers grabbed their swords. One famous example involved a bride whose dowry included a small but strategically vital region. Both kingdoms claimed they deserved control over the land in the interests of peace. Peace meaning, we want it. When the marriage contract was signed, diplomats shook hands, smiled, and then immediately began plotting how to reinterpret the treaty in their favour. On the wedding day, everything looked harmonious until both sides attempted to raise their coat of arms over the same castle at the same time. Flags were torn, insults were hurled, and within a month armies were marching. The marriage, ironically, lasted longer than the peace. Then there were weddings that angered everyone, not just the neighbouring kingdom. When a royal chose the wrong spouse, usually meaning someone unpopular, foreign, or inconvenient, their own people revolted. One king married a princess from an enemy territory because he genuinely liked her. His nobles did not. They accused her of scheming, spying, smuggling, witchcraft, and, most scandalously, using her influence to suggest new types of table linens. The rebellion that followed had nothing to do with linens, but people needed reasons to riot back then, and linen-based rage apparently felt legitimate. The king ended up fighting his own subjects in what historians politely call a domestic misunderstanding. Sometimes the wars weren't about politics at all, they were about pride, wounded egos, and the emotional maturity levels of angry toddlers. In one spectacular case, 2 kingdoms arranged a marriage to unite their dynasties. All went well until the groom's father publicly complained that the bride's wedding procession lacked splendour. The bride's father, offended to the core of his royal beard, responded by calling the groom's father a pompous donkey. Diplomatic letters flew back and forth, somewhere between pompous donkey and insufferable worm. Swords were drawn. The couple, caught helplessly in the middle, reportedly whispered to each other during the chaos, "We probably should have eloped." And then there were the grand diplomatic disasters triggered by miscommunication. One bride was sent across the sea with an escort who misinterpreted a foreign salute as an act of aggression. He retaliated. They retaliated harder. Arrows flew. Ships caught fire. By the time the bride reached her groom, two navies were fighting because someone couldn't read the tone of a ceremonial horn. Some royal weddings sparked wars over inheritance. A marriage that united two powerful bloodlines often created a future heir with claims over multiple territories. While this should have been a diplomatic advantage, it usually inspired every neighbouring country to panic simultaneously. After one particularly contentious marriage, 3 rival kingdoms declared war simply because none of them wanted the soon-to-be-born prince to inherit more land than their own rulers possessed. The baby wasn't even born yet and already had enemies. In other cases, wars broke out during the wedding celebrations. One infamous wedding feast erupted into violence when a guest, who had definitely consumed more wine than advisable, accidentally spilled his drink on a noble from a rival clan. The offended noble called it an insult. The drunken guest called it an accident. Their followers called it destiny. Within minutes, swords were drawn, musicians fled, the bride hid behind the wedding cake. By dawn, the feud had escalated so dramatically that 2 entire regions were mobilizing for open conflict. Some wedding-related wars had unusual cultural causes. In one kingdom, it was customary for the bride's family to give symbolic gifts to the groom's family. When the groom's family found their gifts insufficiently luxurious, they lodged an official complaint. The bride's family responded by doubling down, insisting the gifts were symbolic and therefore above material value. The groom's family disagreed loudly. Words became threats. Threats became mobilized cavalry. Meanwhile, the bride and groom simply wanted to enjoy their wedding night without hearing distant war horns. But perhaps the most tragic weddings were the ones that began with peace treaties and ended with shattered hopes. A marriage designed to bring 2 warring kingdoms together often carried the weight of generations of hostility. Ceremony planners whispered, "This wedding will end all conflict." It rarely did. One marriage intended to unite 2 rival houses lasted less than a year before factions on both sides reignited tensions, accusing each other of manipulating the marriage for political advantage. The couple's portraits were taken down, their wedding tapestries were burned, the alliance dissolved like sugar in boiling water. Through all these disasters, one truth shines through. Marriages meant to soothe political wounds often exposed them instead. Instead of forging unity, they highlighted differences. Instead of easing tempers, they inflamed them. Instead of building bridges, they set those bridges on fire while both sides blamed the other for striking the first spark. Whether triggered by pride, politics, misunderstanding, or accusations delivered over spilled wine, these weddings proved one thing: nothing complicates diplomacy quite like romance. Explore real historical unions where the bride took one look at her future husband and thought, absolutely not. Love at first sight? More like regret at first glance. Royal marriages were rarely built on romance, but even the most politically engineered unions hoped for at least a flicker of tolerance between the bride and groom. A smile, a nod, a polite level of indifference. Anything, really. But sometimes, history delivered the dramatic spectacle of a bride looking at her royal fiancé for the first time and thinking, absolutely not. The shock, the horror, the immediate regret. Love at first sight, more like regret at first glance. These moments weren't just awkward, they were seismic. In royal courts, a bride's first reaction could ripple through courtiers, advisors, ambassadors, and dynasties. If she hated him instantly, everyone felt it, and they pretended not to notice, poorly. Royal brides had many reasons for these explosive reactions, and physical appearance, fair or not, was often the initial trigger. Many royal couples met for the first time on the wedding day, or just days before. Portrait painters, eager to please their employers, were notorious for flattering edits. The bride might expect a man with strong features, noble posture, and a hint of princely charm. Instead, she would meet a groom who looked like he had been painted by someone who had never actually seen him, and relied entirely on optimistic imagination. One bride famously burst into tears when she saw her groom enter the hall. Courtiers rushed to reassure her, to calm her, to insist that tears were a beautiful expression of joy. They were not. She later informed her ladies-in-waiting that her tears were caused by the crushing realization that she was about to spend her life married to what she called a human disappointment wearing velvet. Others reacted with stony silence. A queen-to-be once stared at her groom for an entire minute without blinking, as if hoping he might dissolve into mist and spare her the trouble. He did not. She later insisted she was merely absorbing the gravity of the moment, but everyone knew the truth. She was absorbing the gravity of her future misery. Brains could also be a problem. Some grooms were known for dull conversation, shallow thoughts, or the intellectual engagement of damp linen. Brides who had grown up surrounded by clever tutors and polished conversation found themselves confronted with husbands who struggled to form coherent sentences. One bride reportedly whispered to her companion, "If he speaks again, I may faint," which was less about delicacy and more about self-defense. Hygiene sadly was another culprit. Royal men sometimes arrived at their weddings freshly groomed and perfumed. Others arrived as themselves. One bride recoiled so dramatically upon smelling her future husband that courtiers assumed she was ill. No, she was simply encountering the royal scent, a medieval combination of sweat, fur, leather, wine, and whatever unfortunate substance his hunting dogs had rolled in. Personality clashes were immediate and brutal. In royal courts, personalities were political weapons. A bride might expect a confident ruler. What she got was a man who giggled uncontrollably, or boasted loudly, or acted like an overgrown teenager with a crown. One groom tried to impress his bride by performing a sword flourish mid-conversation. He nearly sliced the hem of her gown. She did not find this charming. Other brides hated the groom because of reputation. Royal gossip travelled fast. Some grooms came to the altar with histories of affairs, scandals, cruelty, or questionable decisions involving expensive horses and irresponsible wages. Brides, hearing these rumours, arrived with all the enthusiasm of someone being escorted to a lion's den. One princess allegedly whispered, "I have seen better men in nightmares," after meeting her groom. The groom, unaware, smiled proudly at her. And then there were the personality expectations. Some royal women were raised to be strong, intelligent rulers. They arrived prepared to share power, influence policy, and shape their kingdom. Instead, they found themselves married to men who were threatened by a woman with opinions. One bride famously said, "I will be queen, not his shadow," and began her marriage with all the warmth of an icicle. Her husband, deeply offended, responded by sulking through the entire wedding feast. But perhaps the most dramatic instant hatred came from political betrayal. Occasionally a bride would discover, only moments before the wedding, that her groom had insulted her family, broken a promise, or sent letters filled with subtle, or not so subtle, threats. She would meet him at the altar with a tight smile and a heart full of vengeance. Court witnesses described brides delivering vows through clenched teeth, their voices sweet but their eyes promising retribution. Some brides tried to hide their disgust with royal composure. Others did not. One queen was so overwhelmed by disappointment that she refused to sit beside her new husband during the feast, choosing instead to sit between two ambassadors who spent the entire dinner panicking about the diplomatic implications of being used as human buffers. Another bride physically leaned away from her groom every time he spoke, creating the visual impression that her chair was slowly migrating toward another country. But here's the twist. Not all instant hatred lasted forever. Some couples slowly grew tolerant of each other. A few even found affection hidden beneath layers of resentment. Others, however, grew only more miserable with time, trapped in dynastic obligations that cared nothing for personal feelings. Their coldness became the stuff of legends, whispered behind fans and recorded in letters dripping with political gossip. Royal marriages weren't designed for love, and history rarely gave brides a voice in choosing their partners. Instant hatred was a natural, if dramatically inconvenient, reaction to the brutal realities of dynastic duty. And if the bride's face fell the moment she saw the groom, well, that was simply another chapter in the long saga of royal wedding disasters. Nervous royal grooms who mangled vows, mispronounced names, or forgot entirely why they were standing there. And now you may recite your vows. My what now? Royal grooms were raised to lead armies, sign treaties, manage councils, inherit crowns, and survive assassination attempts with stoic dignity. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for the crushing terror of reciting wedding vows in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of judgmental witnesses. Priests could be patient, courtiers could be supportive, but the moment the priest announced, "And now you may recite your vows," many royal grooms responded with the vacant stare of a man whose brain had just packed its bags and quietly left the building. My what now? Wedding day nerves are universal, but royal grooms had an extra layer of performance pressure. Their vows weren't simply declarations of love, they were political commitments, dynastic contracts, and symbols of the kingdom's stability. Every word mattered, every mispronunciation was noted, every pause was scrutinized, and every mistake was whispered about long after the feast ended, sometimes for generations. Let's begin with the classic blunder, forgetting the vows entirely. One prince stood before his bride, chest out, posture perfect, until the priest turned to him expectantly. His expression shifted from regal confidence to sheer existential crisis. He mouthed a silent help to his best man, who shrugged. After several seconds of painful silence, the prince finally muttered, "I also agree," despite the fact that nothing had been asked yet. The priest cleared his throat. The bride blinked. The nobles exchanged looks of pure amusement. Diplomats scribbled notes, believing the odd remark to be some sort of coded political message. Mispronunciation was another popular disaster. Royal brides' names were often long, foreign, or politically significant, three qualities that combined into a perfect trap for tongue-tied grooms. One groom notoriously mangled the bride's name so thoroughly that it sounded like he was summoning a small forest animal. The bride corrected him gently. He attempted again. He made it worse. By the fourth attempt, the priest stepped in to rescue him. Though the guests spent the remainder of the ceremony trying not to snicker, other grooms mispronounced key parts of their vows. Words like honor, obedience, fidelity, and unity frequently became victims of royal panic. A famous example involved a king who intended to say, "With all my worldly goods I thee endow," but instead proclaimed, "With all my worldly goods, not goats." The correction came too late. The crowd erupted in muffled laughter. His bride raised one eyebrow in the kind of regal expression that said, "You will never live this down." And she was right. He didn't. Some grooms went blank mid-sentence. One royal groom, determined to appear confident, insisted on delivering his vows from memory rather than reading them. He practiced for days. He rehearsed in front of his mirror. He repeated them to his horse. But when the moment arrived, a spotlight on him, bride watching, court holding its breath, his mind emptied itself like a broom sweeping a room clean. The silence grew unbearable. The bride whispered the first phrase to him. He repeated it, then forgot the second phrase. She whispered again. This continued until the vows sounded less like a sacred union and more like a theatrical script read by two actors who had never met. Another royal groom became so anxious that he spoke his vows at double speed, producing a blur of sound that was transcribed later as mumble mumble mum. No one understood anything he said, not the bride, not the court, not even the priest, but the confidence of his delivery convinced everyone to nod along. It was only when he attempted to kiss the bride prematurely, interrupting the final blessing, that the priest realized the groom had absolutely no idea what was happening. Some grooms sabotaged themselves by trying to be charming. One groom added an unscripted joke to lighten the mood. Unfortunately, his humor was questionable. He announced, "I promise to be loyal, even when you are cross," which I hear is often. The bride froze, her smile crisping at the edges like burnt sugar. The court gasped in unison, producing a noise like wind being sucked through a tapestry. The groom's father later described the moment as brave, but disastrously stupid. A different groom attempted to improvise romantic lines, thinking it would impress his bride. Instead, he became emotional, rambled about her luminous forehead, and declared her more radiant than the torches lining this church, which would have been sweet had the torches not been producing an unfortunate amount of smoke. Guests coughed. The bride's eyes watered, and not from emotion. Some ceremonies were derailed by grooms who forgot the basic instructions. One prince kept standing when he was supposed to kneel, then knelt when everyone else stood. Another tried to grab the wrong ring. Another reached for the priest's ceremonial staff instead of the bride's hand. There was even a groom who became so lost in the choreography that he stepped backward and tripped over a cushion, falling with the grace of a collapsing clothesline. In a particularly legendary case, a groom was so overwhelmed by his duties that he forgot where he was entirely. As the priest spoke, he glanced around the cathedral with vague confusion, then whispered to his advisor, "Is this the coronation?" His advisor, horrified, whispered back, "No, sire, this is your wedding." The groom straightened his robes and attempted to look invested, though eyewitnesses claim he seemed confused for the rest of the ceremony. Priests suffered during these bungled moments too. Some pinched the bridge of their noses in exhaustion. Others tried to guide the groom like a teacher helping a struggling student read aloud. A few simply powered through, determined to finish the ceremony, even if the groom accidentally married the wrong person, the wrong object, or, given the tension, the nearest candle stand. Yet despite the fumbling, the stuttering, the mispronunciations, and the complete brain shutdowns, the ceremonies always continued. Weddings survived. History marched on, and royal grooms, bless their terrified hearts, became unforgettable. Their failures did not destroy kingdoms, their mistakes did not break treaties, but they certainly gave future historians excellent material. Live animals, strange artifacts, deeply weird tokens of affection, royal gift exchanges that made everyone uncomfortable. Because nothing says congrats like gifting the couple a baby crocodile. Royal weddings were grand, sparkling, ceremonially overloaded affairs, but nothing surprised, puzzled, or traumatized guests quite like the gifts. For modern couples, gifts might include cookware, fancy linens, or a politely boring card filled with money. But royal couples, they received items so bizarre, so impractical, and so occasionally alive that one wonders whether their kingdom secretly held competitions for weirdest possible wedding tribute. Because nothing says congrats like gifting the couple a baby crocodile. In the geopolitical theatre of royal weddings, gifts served multiple purposes. They displayed wealth, they impressed rivals, they symbolized alliances, they made the gift giver look important. But what they rarely did, was make sense. Let's begin with the live animals, because yes, that happened far more often than any normal person would consider acceptable. Exotic creatures were popular diplomatic gestures. A lion, for example, could signify strength. A rare bird could represent peace. A camel might signal connection to distant desert kingdoms. These symbols were beautiful in theory. In practice, the animals frequently caused chaos. One newlywed couple received a baby crocodile from a visiting sultan who swore it symbolized loyalty. Courtiers gasped. The bride fainted. The crocodile snapped at a servant's shoe. No one knew what to do with it. The palace didn't exactly have a crocodile enclosure. Eventually, the unfortunate creature was given its own indoor fountain, where it sulked for years, terrorizing anyone who walked too close. Elephants were another classic gift. Massive, expensive, and wholly unsuitable for castle courtyards. A king once presented an elephant adorned in embroidered cloth, gold chains, and bells. It was a breathtaking creature, until it smelled the wedding feast and marched directly toward the roast boar, sending guests scrambling like panicked ants. The groom, trying to salvage dignity, insisted the elephant was a blessing. The elephant, meanwhile, blessed the courtyard floor with an enormous pile of symbolic devastation. Falcons, parrots, monkeys, horses, and peacocks also made frequent appearances. One bride famously received a pair of rare parrots trained to say flattering compliments in 3 languages. Unfortunately, the birds learned new phrases during the wedding feast, the rowdy drinking songs shouted by the soldiers at the back table. The parrots later entertained the court with phrases wildly inappropriate for royal company. Not all gifts were alive. Some were simply deeply confusing. Royal families exchanged artifacts with such strange symbolic meaning that even historians struggle to understand them. One groom received a gilded, jewel-encrusted spoon, large enough to stir destiny, according to the gift note. Destiny was not stirred, but several soups were. Another bride received a ceremonial throne made of polished bone. Not human, thankfully, but dramatic nonetheless. The giver claimed it represented strength and rebirth. The bride claimed it represented something I don't want in my sitting room. Other artifacts bordered on cursed. One king gifted his daughter a mirror, said to show the future happiness of her marriage. The mirror cracked during the journey. No one dared tell the bride, so the servants quietly hid it behind a tapestry. The marriage eventually collapsed, and the court retroactively blamed the mirror, because blaming mirrors is easier than blaming politics. Weapons were another common gift. Symbolic swords, ornate daggers, jewelled axes. It was quite normal for a royal bride to receive enough weaponry to arm a small militia. One bride unwrapped a ceremonial sword so heavy she couldn't lift it without assistance. Her ladies-in-waiting carried it around like oversized cutlery until someone found a wall sturdy enough to display it. Land was also given, though land gifts went terribly wrong more often than not. A groom once gifted his bride a stretch of countryside that unfortunately contained a very stubborn village. The villagers refused to acknowledge the royal transfer, arguing they had not been consulted about being gifted like a fruit basket. They rebelled promptly, creating an awkward situation where the bride owned land that aggressively did not want to be owned. Some gifts were simply impractical. A queen received an elaborate mechanical clock shaped like a dragon that breathed sparks. It malfunctioned on its first demonstration, setting fire to several decorative hangings. Another king presented his son with a library of rare manuscripts, none of which the son could read because they were written in a dead language the kingdom had forgotten centuries ago. One princess received a massive gemstone carved into the shape of a potato. No symbolism was provided. No explanation followed. The court stared at it in silence, collectively unsure whether this was a compliment or a threat. Food gifts were also common but rarely safe. Entire carts of salted fish, barrels of wine, trays of sugared fruits, and wheels of cheese sometimes travelled days or weeks to reach the wedding. By the time they arrived, they were often fragrant. One wedding famously suffered the misfortune of receiving a wheel of cheese so aged and potent that it had developed ideas of its own. Servants refused to carry it. Dogs refused to approach it. The king eventually ordered it buried like a fallen soldier. Gardens full of imported plants were another trend. Exotic flowers, shrubs and trees were delivered as symbols of growth and prosperity. But foreign plants did not always cooperate. A tree from across the sea wilted the moment it arrived, signalling eternal love in theory, but please don't force me to live here in practice. And then there were the oddly personal gifts. One prince gave his bride a portrait of himself, half life-size, half shirtless, fully alarming. Guests gasped. The bride blinked in disbelief. The groom beamed proudly. It was displayed in the palace for exactly 3 hours before someone moved it behind a curtain for preservation. With every baffling tribute, every roaring animal, every strange artifact, every object clearly chosen by someone with questionable taste, royal couples smiled, nodded, and pretended to be delighted. Diplomacy demanded it. But behind those courtly smiles lurked the universal truth. Royal gift-giving was less about generosity and more about bewildering political theatre. Dueling nobles' drunken brawls, rivals settling arguments mid-banquet, weddings where the guests forgot the word peace. It's not a royal wedding unless someone tries to swing a candlestick at someone else. Royal weddings were supposed to be symbols of unity, harmony, and carefully staged political smiles. In practice, they were pressure cookers full of rivalries, envy, alcohol, unresolved feuds, and nobles who had the self-control of caffeinated ferrets. If the ceremony was the calm, the banquet was the storm. And if the banquet was the storm, the guests were the lightning bolts trying to set the table linens on fire. It's not a royal wedding unless someone tries to swing a candlestick at someone else. Some weddings didn't just include fights, they practically advertised them. Royals invited households that had spent generations sabotaging, insulting, or outright stabbing each other. The logic seemed to be, yes, these families despise each other, but surely surrounding them with wine and sharp carving knives will go fine. Every royal wedding planner in history likely aged 20 years planning the seating chart. Let's begin with the classic noble duels. Formal duels were usually forbidden at weddings, something about maintaining decorum and not spilling blood on the ceremonial tableware. But nobles are creative, and if they couldn't duel outside, they improvised indoors. One infamous event began when a duke accused another noble of stepping on his cloak with malicious intent. The accused noble responded that the duke's cloak was longer than his sense. This insult, a masterpiece of efficiency, sparked a duel conducted with the only available weapons, bread knives. The bread knives bent immediately, leaving both men whacking each other with rapidly deformed cutlery while guests shouted conflicting instructions. The bride fainted. The groom pretended to be deeply occupied with his goblet. Eventually, the Queen Mother separated the duelists by sheer glare power alone. But not all fights came from noble egos. Sometimes they came from drunken enthusiasm. Wine was plentiful at royal feasts, often more plentiful than water, and nobles drank it like hydration was a moral failing. As the night progressed, voices got louder, movements got wilder, and tempers grew shorter. One wedding erupted into chaos when a drunken lord attempted to demonstrate a traditional dance from his homeland. This dance involved swinging his arms in large circles. Unfortunately, one of those circles connected directly with the nose of a visiting ambassador. The ambassador's bodyguards reacted instantly. The drunken lord's friends reacted louder. Before long, the band tried playing faster music in the desperate hope that guests would choose dancing over violence. They did not. Some fights were caused by old insults resurfacing at the worst possible moment. At one wedding, two nobles who had hated each other for years were seated at the same table in what must have been a cosmic prank. Everything went smoothly until dessert, when one noble made a comment about the other's family lineage, a comment previously responsible for 3 fistfights and 1 horse theft. The second noble responded by throwing a candied pear at his rival's forehead. Chaos erupted, candlesticks were seized, cakes were weaponized. The Queen reportedly stood up, sighed, and said, "Again?" Sometimes the fighting wasn't even between nobles. Sometimes it was between their retinues. Royal households travelled with entourages of assistants, guards, scribes, cooks, falcon tenders, and cousins who refused to stay home. These entourages were notoriously territorial. At one wedding, 2 rival households arrived with banners of nearly identical design. The followers argued for hours about whose banner was more dignified. When someone suggested they both looked like tablecloths, the fight began. By the end, 10 men were thrown into a decorative fountain, and one banner was tragically used as a mop. Even more dramatic were fights caused by misunderstandings. For example, a noble might lean over to speak to a friend, accidentally bumping someone's drink. The bumped guest, already irritated from sitting through a 5-hour ceremony, interpreted the bump as a grave insult. He rose to protest. His rival rose in defense. Someone shouted, "Let them fight!" Someone else shouted, "No, please, don't!" And suddenly the entire room split into factions like drunken dominoes. Royal guards were expected to keep the peace, but they often contributed to the chaos. One guard, trying to break up a fight, slipped on spilled custard and crashed into another guard. The second guard fell into a visiting noble, who panicked and shouted something that was interpreted as a challenge to a duel. Within seconds, half the hall was standing, half was ducking, and the orchestra was debating whether to keep playing. They did. Because musicians at royal weddings were contractually obligated to pretend nothing was happening. Food made excellent improvised weaponry. Loaves of bread became projectiles. Turkeys became blunt instruments. One record describes a noble using a roasted pheasant, as one might swing a particularly angry bouquet. Another bride later complained that her wedding feast looked like a battlefield fought entirely with appetizers, and yet, sometimes the fights weren't violent, they were petty, dramatic, and absolutely ridiculous. Some nobles fought by loudly gossiping about their enemies while sitting no more than 2 feet away. Others clashed in passive-aggressive ways, such as rearranging seating cards or loudly critiquing the bride's dowry in the ambassador's native language. There were nobles who challenged each other to duels over who had the finer moustache. One dispute even broke out over whose family owned the most swans. The kingdom had only 7 swans. The argument lasted an hour. The saddest fights were the ones involving people who should have behaved, the relatives. One queen's wedding became legendary because her 2 uncles engaged in a shouting match so fierce that the groom's mother locked herself in a side room to wait for the embarrassment to pass. Another royal wedding erupted into family chaos when a cousin insulted another cousin's hat. Words escalated. Someone threatened banishment. Someone else threw a spoon. Through all this, the bride and groom, poor souls, sat at the high table trying to maintain their dignity while thinking, "Is this our fault?" But here's the ironic twist. These disasters often became the most memorable part of the celebration. Court insiders would later whisper, "Yes, the ceremony was beautiful, but did you see Lord Henry try to fight a bishop with a dinner roll?" These stories became legends, retold for decades with increasing exaggeration. Royal weddings were meant to bind kingdoms together. The guests, however, frequently failed to read the memo. Weddings held during epidemics, mass fainting episodes, and the ceremony that happened while half the court was bedridden. Sickness and health, apparently both happening at once. Royal weddings were supposed to symbolize prosperity, divine favor, and the continued survival of the dynasty. Unfortunately, nothing mocks human optimism quite like disease. While modern couples fret over seating charts and floral arrangements, royal couples of the past had to worry about whether their guests would still be alive by the time the vows were finished. Sickness and health, apparently both happening at once. History is full of royal weddings that unfolded under ominous clouds, not of metaphorical doom, but of actual airborne pathogens drifting helpfully through the crowd. Plagues, fevers, mysterious rashes, stomach illnesses, and fainting fits all made cameo appearances in ceremonies that were supposed to radiate joy. Guests coughed, sniffled, paled, and occasionally dropped like wilted flowers while the royal couple desperately tried to pretend everything was going smoothly. Let's start with the most dramatic scenario. Weddings held in the middle of an epidemic. When a disease swept across a city, weddings should have been postponed. However, royal calendars were inflexible beasts. Diplomats had already travelled. Nobles had already polished their family jewels. The banquet food was already slowly spoiling in the kitchens. Cancelling would cause political panic, so rulers often chose the second worst option, forging ahead and hoping the plague had the decency to wait until after dessert. In one famous case, the royal wedding took place while an epidemic raged just beyond the palace walls. The solution, according to the king's brilliant advisors, was to pack everyone tightly into a single grand hall and close all the doors to keep the sickness out. Instead, they created a perfect environment for airborne misery. Guests began coughing before the procession even started. One nobleman tried to disguise his symptoms by claiming he was overcome with emotion, but nobody believes a man is moved to tears by the candle arrangements. By the end of the night, the banquet resembled a symphony of sneezes. But even outside full-blown plagues, illness crept into royal weddings with unnerving regularity. Food poisoning, not to be confused with the culinary disasters of earlier chapters, was a frequent uninvited guest. One wedding feast became infamous because a dish of spoiled fish circulated among the high tables. It wasn't discovered until several nobles abruptly left the hall looking green around the edges. Servants whispered of a curse, but the real curse was poor refrigeration and the belief that fish could safely travel inland without consequences. Mass fainting episodes were equally dramatic. Royal attire was heavy, the ceremonies were suffocatingly long, and cathedrals were packed with hundreds of people breathing the same warm, incense-saturated air. Noble women toppled over at alarming rates, collapsing like decorative dominoes. Men fainted too, though they tried to disguise it as kneeling with enthusiasm. In one wedding, the priest's sermon was interrupted by a synchronized collapse of 3 bridesmaids. The bride tried to maintain composure, but when the 4th bridesmaid began swaying like an undecided tree in a storm, the entire ceremony paused. The musicians played a gentle tune while servants dragged unconscious guests to the outer aisles like sacks of flour. And then we have the extraordinary wedding where half the court was bedridden. This particular couple had the misfortune of scheduling their marriage during a seasonal fever outbreak. Rather than postpone, the palace decided to continue with whoever was still capable of standing vertically. The result? A ceremony where the choir was missing half its members. The bride's mother watched from a chair because she lacked the strength to stand, and several nobles attended wrapped in blankets embroidered with their family crests. The groom's brother tried to give a toast but was interrupted by a coughing fit so intense it echoed across the entire hall. The king later declared the event beautiful and heartfelt, though observers noted that heartfelt probably wasn't the word he meant. Some weddings were plagued, literally, by mysterious ailments that struck at the worst possible moment. At one ceremony, an unknown illness caused guests to develop sudden dizziness. People clutched pews, leaned on each other, and whispered anxiously. One ambassador insisted the kingdom was cursed, another claimed the air was poisoned. A court physician, summoned in a panic, diagnosed everyone with nerves. Translation: nobody had a clue. Diseases also created logistical nightmares. Royal weddings relied heavily on processions, but parades of coughing, shivering guests were not exactly symbols of royal splendour. In one notable wedding, the groom arrived pale and sweating profusely, not from nerves, but from an unfortunately timed fever. The bride approached him with a mixture of concern and horror. When he attempted to speak his vows, his voice cracked, then squeaked, then disappeared entirely. The priest waited patiently, the guests waited impatiently. The groom croaked like a dying goose. Worse still were the clergymen who fell ill. Royal weddings required high-ranking church officials, and those officials were not always healthy. One bishop, tasked with officiating a major royal wedding, was so ill he had to lean heavily on 2 attendants. Halfway through the ceremony, he paused, swayed, and sneezed with such force that several candles flickered out. The symbolism was debated for weeks. And then there were the weddings where invisible illnesses caused panic. If one guest developed a fever mid-ceremony, everyone around them slowly shifted away, trying to look subtle, while creating a 3-seat buffer of self-preservation. Guests covered their mouths with lace gloves. Whispered rumours spread. Did you see him sneeze? She looks pale. Does she look pale? I think I heard a cough. Was that a cough? The paranoia spread faster than the disease itself. Despite the fear, the fainting, the coughing, the feverish chaos, royal weddings forged ahead. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, the feasts held, people danced, awkwardly, slowly, often wheezing through it, but they danced. And afterwards, court chroniclers wrote glowing descriptions of the day, leaving out the parts about the piles of fainted guests and the fact that the groom spent half the banquet horizontal. Because at the end of the day, even the threat of disease couldn't stop royalty from putting on a show. The kingdom needed hope, the people needed reassurance, and the monarchs needed heirs. If a plague happened to attend the wedding too, well, that was simply another complication for future historians to laugh about. Priests fighting monarchs over traditions, ceremonies delayed by arguments, ritual chaos. and political tension. Two powerful institutions, one aisle, zero chill. Royal weddings were meant to symbolize harmony, unity, and the pleasing illusion that everyone involved agreed on something. But nothing threatened this fragile facade more than the centuries-old rivalry between church and state. When these two mighty forces shared a ceremonial aisle, the result was less holy matrimony and more hostile negotiation with incense. Two powerful institutions, one aisle, zero chill. For monarchs, royal weddings were political theatre, carefully staged spectacles designed to broadcast their authority. For the church, weddings were sacred rituals that belonged under the solemn control of clergy. The result, naturally, was chaos. Every time a royal wedding approached, the clergy and the crown circled each other like two cats fighting over a single sunny patch of carpet. Let's start with the arguments over ritual authority. Monarchs believed that because they were the state, their word overruled everyone and everything, including religious tradition. Priests, meanwhile, believed that a king might very well be divinely appointed, but that didn't give him the right to rearrange sacred rites like he was redecorating the palace foyer. One spectacular feud began when a king insisted the ceremony start with a royal proclamation of loyalty and lineage. The archbishop responded with, "Absolutely not." The ceremony begins with holy invocation. The king countered, "Not at my wedding, it doesn't." The archbishop countered, "Yes, at all weddings it does." The back and forth continued until they realised guests were already arriving, and someone had to pretend maturity first. In the end, the ceremony began with both the king and the archbishop speaking simultaneously, creating a sound that witnesses described as the world's politest shouting match. Other conflicts revolved around symbolic gestures. One monarch insisted on inserting a new blessing that praised the dynasty's military victories. The clergy were horrified. Weddings were a place for love and devotion, not aggressive bragging about enemy casualties. The king refused to back down. After hours of argument, a compromise was reached. The blessing would mention victories of the spirit, which everyone agreed meant absolutely nothing and therefore offended no one. But the biggest battlefield was the ceremonial script. The church required strict, ancient rites that had been followed for generations. Monarchs wanted the ceremony to reflect their power and political goals. Priests often reacted to royal suggestions the way scholars react to toddlers scribbling in ancient manuscripts. One king wanted his bride to enter the cathedral through the main doors like a rising sun, symbolising the dawn of a new dynasty. The priest pointed out that tradition required her to enter through the side chapel to preserve modesty, and the king argued that his bride was a queen, not a timid lamp. The priest argued that modesty was a virtue. The king argued that symbolism was more important than virtue. The priest argued that this was precisely why monarchs needed church supervision. The bride entered through the main doors anyway, because even the strongest traditions crumble when a determined monarch waves his scepter. Some weddings were delayed for hours, while church and state argued backstage, sometimes literally backstage, behind tapestries, whisper screaming like parents fighting at a school play. Courtiers wasted time rearranging flowers, refilling incense, or pretending not to hear the muffled threats coming from the clergy chamber. At one infamous wedding, the ceremony was delayed nearly half a day because the bishop refused to perform the vows unless the king agreed to kneel during a particular blessing. The king argued he bowed to no one except God. The bishop argued that this was for God. The king argued the bishop was overstepping. The bishop argued the king was spiritually stubborn. Eventually, after a stalemate long enough to qualify as a historical documentary, the king agreed to bend slightly, which court chroniclers later described as a movement so subtle it may have been the breeze. Music caused its own wars. Royal musicians wanted triumphant, majestic fanfares. Church choirs wanted solemn chants. In one ceremony, the choir and the trumpeters accidentally performed at the same time, producing a sound so jarring it halted the procession. The bride froze. The groom blinked. The archbishop clutched his heart. The musicians, mortified, later blamed each other for the acoustic catastrophe. Even the placement of religious relics triggered hostilities. One king insisted on positioning royal banners near the altar. The clergy balked. The altar was sacred space. The king insisted. The banners were sacred symbols of the realm. The bishops responded, no earthly symbol was sacred in the house of God. The king countered, everything in the kingdom was under his authority, including the house of God. This earned him several stern sermons, 5 huffy bishops, and one very tense wedding choir. On rare occasions, priests retaliated during the ceremony itself. At one royal wedding, a bishop, furious that the king refused to remove a decorative sword during the blessing, deliberately paused the ceremony for almost an entire minute to reflect incense. That minute felt like an hour. The king fumed, the guests sweated. The bride wished she had eloped. Sometimes the church won. Other times the crown did. But the real loser was always the ceremony itself, which ended up a hybrid blend of spiritual reverence and royal ego. Guests were left wondering whether they had witnessed a sacred union or a power struggle wrapped in lace. And yet, for all the tension, these battles became legendary. People whispered about them for decades. Court poets turned them into satirical verses. Chroniclers embellished them into soap operatic triumphs of pride and stubbornness. The royal couple may have been the stars of the wedding, but the real entertainment came from watching the church and state glare at each other across the aisle. 2 mighty institutions locked in a silent war over candles, choreography, and who got to speak first. Some royal weddings were held during mourning periods, with black-clad guests trying to celebrate and grieve simultaneously. Imagine celebrating eternal love while everyone looks like they're attending a vampire convention. Royal weddings were supposed to be dazzling bursts of colour, silk shimmering, jewels glittering, trumpets echoing through the great hall. But occasionally history delivered the bleakest plot twist imaginable. The wedding had to proceed during a mourning period. Picture the scene, a bride stepping into her future while the entire court is dressed like undertakers. A groom exchanging vows under banners of black. Guests whispering blessings while layers of grief hang in the air, thicker than incense. Imagine celebrating eternal love while everyone looks like they're attending a vampire convention. These strange hybrid ceremonies, half joyous union, half funereal obligation, were not just unusual, they were deeply uncomfortable. Yet monarchs sometimes had no choice. Political treaties demanded deadlines. Foreign diplomats could not be kept waiting. Succession crises loomed. And so, despite tragedy, the wedding marched on, wrapped in sorrow like a bouquet of wilted flowers. The first shock for many attending such weddings was the wardrobe situation. Normally, royal weddings were visual feasts, dresses of crimson, gold, emerald, azure. But mourning protocols were strict. Black. All black. Perhaps some grey if you were feeling rebellious. A touch of deep purple if you wanted to risk the wrath of tradition. One bride forced to marry mere weeks after her father's death wore a gown described as beautiful, but as cheerful as a cloud of despair. Ladies-in-waiting shuffled around her like solemn ravens. The groom, wearing a black cloak instead of ceremonial finery, looked less like a bridegroom and more like someone preparing to deliver tragic news. And the guests, oh the guests. Instead of jubilant faces and bright feathers, the wedding hall resembled a council of nocturnal spirits convening to discuss haunting rites. Thick veils covered faces, black gloves muffled clapping. Even jewellery was dark. Jet stones, smoky quartz, pearls dyed to match the gloom. The court jeweller likely considered retiring halfway through the orders, overwhelmed by the number of requests for something elegant that does not sparkle too optimistically. Music added another layer of oddness. Royal weddings normally featured triumphant processions, lively dances, and ceremonial fanfares meant to shake the dust off the rafters. But mourning etiquette demanded restraint. So instead of upbeat melodies, the musicians played slow, sombre pieces. One wedding's processional music was so dreary that several ambassadors quietly wondered if they had wandered into the wrong event. As the bride walked, the strings wept gently and the percussion section sat in silence, forbidden to create anything resembling festivity. The overall effect was that of a love story being performed at half speed. The atmosphere inside the cathedral or palace hall was a strange blend of happiness forcibly wearing a mask of sorrow. People smiled carefully, gently, as though afraid excessive joy might offend the recently deceased. Laughter was stifled, conversations were whispered. Even the toasts at the reception were morose affairs. To the bride and groom, may their union bring comfort, despite everything. And if the deceased had been particularly beloved, the emotional tension skyrocketed. One wedding took place mere days after the death of a revered Queen Mother. The bride cried through half the ceremony, not because of matrimonial nerves, but because her mother's absence weighed heavily on the occasion. Guests attempted to maintain composure, but the charged silence made the whole event feel like a beautifully choreographed heartbreak. The grooms stood at the altar trying to smile reassuringly, yet doing so while surrounded by black-draped columns made the smile feel unsettlingly out of place. Sometimes the deceased was not a family member at all, but a national figure whose passing triggered weeks of mourning. Cancelling the wedding would offend allies, but celebrating it too brightly would appear disrespectful. The compromise, a muted wedding that satisfied no one. One such ceremony was so restrained that guests later described it as a wedding only technically. Even the banquet was subdued. No music, no dancing, no colourful desserts. The wedding cake, decorated in white and deep grey, looked more like a marble mausoleum than a symbol of sweetness. These mourning weddings also suffered from a problem unique to their sombre nature. Guests were already emotionally fragile. People cried easily. They grew reflective. Some fell into philosophical conversations about mortality during the feast. One ambassador supposedly toasted the couple by saying, "May your joys be as long as life, and your sorrows as short as memory," causing half the table to break into tears and the other half to stare at their wine in solemn contemplation. Even the rituals took on altered significance. Gestures that normally symbolize joy, ringing bells, lighting candles, sharing wine, felt heavy, loaded with meaning, twisted by grief. At one wedding, the ceremonial bells chimed in slow funeral intervals. The symbolism was so strong that one guest muttered, "Are they marrying or burying the future?" Luckily, this comment was whispered only to his neighbour, who nearly choked trying not to laugh. Perhaps the strangest moments of all were the reception dances. Some weddings forbade dancing entirely. Others allowed only gentle, slow-paced movements that looked more like drifting than dancing. Imagine dozens of royals drifting in circles like sombre ghosts, all while the musicians played melodies chosen specifically to avoid cheerfulness. Someone once described the scene as a polite haunting. Yet for all the bleakness, these weddings were deeply human. They captured the strange truth that life does not pause for grief, nor grief for life. Monarchs married under shadows because kingdoms needed heirs, alliances needed sealing, and the future demanded attention, however inconveniently. And sometimes these sorrow-wrapped unions became some of the strongest marriages in history, perhaps because the couple began not with celebration, but with shared solemnity. They stood together side by side on a day burdened with mourning and carved out a quiet pocket of hope. But still, a wedding during a mourning period remains one of history's most surreal mashups. Joy and sorrow walking hand in hand. Champagne poured into goblets held by trembling hands. Love declared in rooms that smelled faintly of grief. A wedding that was technically a celebration, but emotionally, a funeral in disguise. Broken rings, failed unity ceremonies, candles that wouldn't stay lit, and symbols going hilariously wrong. When even the symbolic gestures were like, "Sorry, I can't support this marriage." Royal weddings were engineered to be overflowing with symbolism. Rituals meant to impress guests, flatter foreign dignitaries, and convince the heavens that this marriage was blessed by every known celestial power. Rings symbolized eternity, candles symbolized unity, ribbons symbolized binding destinies, wine symbolized shared fortune, and every ritual, every gesture, every object was scrupulously planned to communicate harmony. But symbols have one tiny flaw: they don't always cooperate. And few things are funnier or more panic-inducing than watching a carefully choreographed ritual go hilariously wrong in front of an entire court. When even the symbolic gestures were like, "Sorry, I can't support this marriage." Let's begin with the humble wedding ring. Royal rings were not simple gold bands. They were extravagant, jewel-encrusted declarations of wealth, legacy, and craftsmanship. Unfortunately, these oversized masterpieces were often terrible at doing the one job required of them: sliding onto a finger. One prince, eager to show confidence, seized the ring and shoved it with such force that the bride flinched. The ring refused to move, stubbornly gripping her knuckle like a small glittering bear trap. The assembly watched in breathless horror as the prince twisted, pushed and tugged, essentially wrestling with his future spouse's hand while she attempted to maintain regal composure. Eventually the priest intervened and suggested warming the ring between his hands to encourage cooperation. It did not cooperate. It finally went on only because the bride discreetly applied ceremonial oil during the next hymn. Other rings simply fell. A queen dropped her ring at the exact moment the congregation fell silent, creating an echo so dramatic it sounded like the stone floor itself had gasped. The ring rolled out of reach, bounced off a step, and vanished under the altar. Several priests scrambled after it like panicked beetles while guests whispered, "Is this a sign?" Spoiler: everyone decided it wasn't. But it took a full 20 minutes and a very dusty bishop to retrieve the runaway, symbol of eternal devotion. Unity candles were another disaster waiting to happen. These candles symbolized two families, two houses, two kingdoms joining in harmony, unless of course they refused to light. One famously stubborn candle remained unlit despite multiple attempts. The bride tried, the groom tried, the priest tried, a courtier tried. The candle remained a dark, smoky stick of marital foreshadowing. Eventually someone handed them a different candle, and the ceremony proceeded, but not before half the guests exchanged glances that said, "Should we be worried?" Other candles lit far too well. One unity candle burned so brightly it melted the decorative wax carvings around it. The molten wax dripped dramatically onto the bride's sleeve, creating a sizzling sound that startled half the congregation. The court painter later edited this moment into a serene scene of divine illumination, because history prefers poetic symbolism over bride briefly set on fire. Then there were the ribbons and cords used in hand-fasting rituals. Lovely in theory, absolute chaos in practice. One couple attempted a complicated binding ceremony involving 3 cords braided around their joined hands. Unfortunately, the officiant wrapped them so enthusiastically that the groom found himself genuinely stuck. When he attempted to draw his hand back, he succeeded only in dragging his bride forward like a tethered parade float. They spent the rest of the ritual trying to look emotionally bound together, while discreetly attempting to wiggle their fingers free. Symbolic objects also had a habit of misbehaving. Swords, meant to represent protection, were occasionally dropped with loud metallic clangs that echoed embarrassingly through the cathedral. One queen accidentally unsheathed her ceremonial sword too vigorously, launching it across the altar. The king ducked, the bishop screamed. The sword was later retrieved by a terrified squire who insisted he had never run so fast in his life. At one wedding, a symbolic goblet cracked the moment the bride lifted it. The wine splashed down the front of her gown, creating a crimson streak that looked like a murder mystery waiting to happen. Courtiers panicked. The bride, demonstrating more composure than anyone else in the room, simply handed the goblet back and said, "Perhaps we'll skip that part." Bread-breaking rituals provided their own brand of entertainment. In one kingdom, it was traditional for the newlyweds to break a loaf together to symbolise shared fortune. Unfortunately, this particular loaf was practically petrified. Both bride and groom pushed, pulled, strained, and nothing happened. The crowd leaned forward. The loaf silently mocked them. Finally, the groom gave a heroic tug. The loaf shattered into a cloud of crumbs, which rained down upon the high table like edible confetti. Symbolism achieved messily. Sometimes the symbolic disasters were gentler, but no less embarrassing. A pair of doves, meant to represent purity, escaped their handler too early and pooped on the groom's cloak. A ceremonial bowl of blessed water spilled on a bishop's foot, causing him to shout words very much not in the liturgical script. A tapestry depicting the royal union fell halfway off the wall mid-ceremony, hanging crookedly like a visual critique. And perhaps the most memorable symbol failure occurred at a wedding, where the couple was supposed to walk under a decorative floral arch. The arch, lovingly built by royal gardeners, looked magnificent, until a strong gust of wind collapsed it onto the procession. Flowers rained down, branches snapped, nobles shrieked. The bride disappeared under a pile of roses and emerged looking like a woodland spirit who'd been ambushed by the spring itself. Through all this chaos, the rituals always continued, because royal weddings were unstoppable, juggernauts of tradition, obligation, and polite denial. If a candle refused to light, everyone pretended it meant nothing. If a symbol broke, the priest invented a theological interpretation on the spot. A broken ring, yes, a sign of humility. And afterward, the court quietly agreed that while the rituals had failed in spectacular ways, the marriage itself would surely be fine. Probably, maybe, hopefully. Because if even the symbols were protesting, the couple needed all the optimism they could get. Royal wedding nights were political events, but some became disasters worthy of a sitcom. Nothing kills the mood like 30 courtiers waiting outside the door judging you. Most couples view their wedding night as a private moment. Romantic, intimate, maybe awkward, maybe magical. Royal couples, however, rarely enjoyed such luxury. Their wedding night was not a personal milestone. It was a public duty, a dynastic obligation, and, in some cases, a spectator sport. Nothing kills romance faster than knowing 30 courtiers, 3 advisors, 2 physicians, a confessor, and an overeager chamberlain are standing outside the door waiting to clap politely when the deed is done. Nothing kills the mood like 30 courtiers waiting outside the door, judging you. Royal wedding nights were political theatre disguised as intimacy. The lineage depended on heirs. Heirs depended on consummation, and consummation depended on 2 individuals who often barely knew each other, and who were being pressured, timed, and occasionally coached, like nervous actors about to perform a difficult stunt. Let's begin with the most common disaster: performance anxiety magnified by an audience. Many royal couples arrived in their wedding chamber exhausted, overwhelmed, and terrified. The entire day had been a marathon of ceremony, scrutiny, and standing still while a painter captured their joy. By the time the couple reached the bedchamber, they weren't thinking, "What a romantic night awaits." They were thinking, "Is there any way to escape through that window without breaking both legs?" One king was so nervous that he paced the room for almost an hour, reciting philosophical quotes to calm himself. His new bride watched in silence until he finally approached the bed and promptly fainted onto it. Courtiers waiting outside interpreted the loud thump as a sign of success and cheered. When the king regained consciousness and heard them cheering, he fainted again. Some wedding nights were sabotaged by logistics. Beds were often massive, ornate constructions with towering wooden frames, embroidered drapes, velvet canopies, and enough bedding to smother a small army. One couple attempted to climb into their bed only to sink so deeply into the mountain of feathers that they needed servants to pull them out. Another couple's bed curtains accidentally caught fire from a misplaced candle, forcing the newlyweds to spend their wedding night watching servants run in circles with buckets. Then there were the couples who simply did not like each other. Earlier chapters have covered brides who hated the groom and grooms who were drunk, confused, or absent. But now imagine those exact people being expected to share a bed. One bride reportedly took one look at her husband, snoring loudly before he even finished undressing, and decided she preferred the floor. She wrapped herself in a blanket and slept beside a decorative chest while the groom slumbered blissfully unaware. In another kingdom, the groom spent the entire wedding night nervously discussing military strategy, instead of noticing his bride's increasingly glazed expression. She eventually fell asleep mid-sentence. He didn't notice for 10 minutes and kept talking. Some wedding nights were complicated by well-meaning but intrusive advisors. Physicians sometimes inspected the bed beforehand to ensure proper conditions. Chaplains delivered pre-sleep blessings at volumes entirely inappropriate for the mood. Elder relatives offered advice no newlywed wanted to hear. One queen's aunt famously lectured her on obedient devotion for so long that by the time she left, the bride had fallen asleep fully dressed. Other wedding nights were interrupted by urgent political matters. One king was summoned away because an ambassador took offence at how loudly the nobles at dinner laughed during a toast. Another bride found herself alone for hours because her groom had been whisked off to sign a treaty, still wearing his nightshirt, after rumours of rebellion reached the palace. The consummation was postponed until morning, and then postponed again because he overslept. Animals occasionally contributed to the chaos. A frightened royal dog once hid under the wedding bed, growling at anyone who approached. The groom tried to coax it out. The dog refused. The bride climbed onto a chair. Eventually a servant had to crawl underneath the bed to retrieve the snarling creature, during which the wedding night energy vanished like smoke in a breeze. And we cannot ignore the most dreaded ritual, public confirmation. In some kingdoms, consummation had to be declared, witnessed, or even certified, an absurd tradition that could sour even the warmest marital enthusiasm. Courtiers sometimes waited right outside the chamber, listening for evidence of success, like a deeply misguided choir. One unfortunate couple reportedly whispered so quietly throughout the night that the courtiers assumed failure and debated whether to knock, interrupt, offer encouragement, or simply pretend they hadn't been listening. Another royal bride discovered her wedding chamber window overlooked the courtyard where dozens of curious townsfolk had gathered, with torches, cheering each time the lights in the room flickered. She refused to continue until the shutters were barred, a process that took 3 servants and a ladder. Of course, sometimes the problem was not nerves or interruptions, but sheer physical exhaustion. After hours of ceremony, processions, feasts, dancing, speeches, symbolic rituals, and endless greetings, the newlyweds often collapsed into bed incapable of anything except snoring. Chroniclers rarely recorded these failures, but personal letters reveal plenty of couples who confessed, "We meant to try, truly, but we fell asleep immediately, and again the next night." On the rare occasions when everything went perfectly, privacy, cooperation, willingness, the court still demanded proof that it had gone well. Sheets were displayed, witnesses nodded solemnly, chroniclers scribbled triumphantly, and the poor couple stared at each other in mutual embarrassment. Despite all these disasters, wedding nights held enormous political weight. Countries depended on heirs, dynasties depended on fertility, and the court depended on gossip to survive the winter. If the wedding night went badly, rumours flourished like mould in a damp cellar. Some claimed the king was impotent, others claimed the bride was unwilling, others blamed sorcery, spells, or unfortunate astrological alignments. But in truth, most royal wedding nights were exactly what you'd expect when 2 strangers, 2 nations, and 24 political agendas shared the same room. Noisy, awkward, uncomfortable, and anything but intimate. A sitcom couldn't script it better. Plots, schemes, secret messages, poisoned wine, and political sabotage when enemies saw weddings as opportunities. Who knew the seating chart needed a security team? Royal weddings weren't just ceremonies, they were political magnets. Every ally, rival, spy, schemer, or grudge holder with a heartbeat found an excuse to attend. And where ambitious people gathered, sabotage was never far behind. A royal wedding was the perfect place to disrupt alliances, embarrass enemies, undermine succession plans, or deliver a very dramatic message wrapped in silk and treachery. Who knew the seating chart needed a security team? Let's begin with the most straightforward form of sabotage: poison. Few things terrified royal planners more than a goblet of wine that bubbled suspiciously or a dish that smelled slightly too exotic. Kitchens employed food tasters whose primary career risk was instant death, and yet risks persisted. One wedding nearly descended into tragedy when a high-ranking noble sipped wine, paused, frowned, and collapsed. People screamed. Guards rushed in. The musicians stopped mid-note. But after several tense minutes, it was discovered the noble had simply fainted because he locked his knees during a long speech. The embarrassment nearly outlived him. But actual poisonings did occur. One treacherous faction used a wedding feast to slip tainted honey cakes onto a rival's plate. The plan worked, just not on the intended target. A hungry court jester stole the cake first, ate it happily, collapsed theatrically, and survived only because jesters had robust stomachs, possibly due to eating whatever nobles dropped on the floor. Secret messages were another favourite weapon. Courtiers passed coded letters hidden in bouquets inside gloves, sewn into hems or disguised as prayer notes. One bride discovered a message folded into her sleeve right before the ceremony, a cryptic warning that her new husband's advisor planned to overthrow her family. She nearly dropped her bouquet. No one knew how the saboteur managed to reach her, though rumours claimed a lady-in-waiting had been bribed with jewellery. Another wedding became memorable when a servant accidentally handed the groom a message meant for a conspirator. The groom opened it out of curiosity and read, "Tonight, we strike." His confusion turned to panic. He promptly alerted the entire guard, who swarmed the banquet hall and interrogated every guest, including the bride's elderly grandmother, who was so outraged she threatened to haunt the captain of the guard personally. Sometimes sabotage came disguised as entertainment. Jugglers, dancers, and performers were prime opportunities for infiltrators. At one royal wedding, a troupe of acrobats turned out to be spies. Halfway through their performance, they attempted to set fire to the royal canopy as a political statement. Unfortunately for them, their acrobatic skills did not include understanding how wind works, and the flaming torch they tossed flew backward into their own costumes. The entire troupe fled, smoking and screaming, leaving behind the world's least subtle sabotage attempt. Rival factions also disrupted weddings by manipulating ritual timing. One group delayed the bride's procession by convincing her attendants that a sacred omen required her to walk exactly at the stroke of the next hour. Meanwhile, another faction manipulated the groom's advisors into believing the ceremony must begin early. The result? The groom stood at the altar alone for 30 agonizing minutes, sweating under the weight of 2 kingdoms staring at him like he'd been abandoned. At another wedding, a saboteur tampered with the church bells. Instead of ringing in harmonious celebration, they clanged out a funeral rhythm that made half the guests blanch. The bishop demanded to know who had altered the peals. The bell ringers insisted they had not. The culprit was never found, but the symbolism was so unsettling the bride's uncle wept openly. Some sabotage efforts were purely psychological. Rival houses sent gifts meant to unsettle the bride or groom. One bride received a golden statue engraved with her new family's motto, "Strength in Unity." Only the motto was deliberately misspelled in a way that turned it into "Strength in Futility." She smiled politely, but later used the statue as a doorstop. Another groom received a miniature coffin carved with exquisite craftsmanship. It was meant to symbolize the death of his bachelor days, according to the note. He did not find this charming, neither did anyone else. More dramatic sabotage came in the form of engineered chaos. One faction paid a group of drunken mercenaries to start a brawl during the wedding feast. They succeeded so efficiently that they accidentally sparked a chain reaction. One guard drew his sword, another guest panicked, musicians ducked under tables, and the king nearly choked on a candied almond. The bride ended up standing on a chair shouting, "Stop this at once!" in a voice so commanding that the entire hall froze. Some conspirators took advantage of the crowd itself. Weddings were massive, hundreds, sometimes thousands of guests. Perfect cover for people who wanted to blend in, whisper rumours or stage accidental insults designed to spark disputes. One saboteur intentionally spilled wine on a foreign ambassador, igniting a diplomatic crisis that lasted 3 weeks. Another slipped misleading information to guests about the seating order. Suddenly nobles were arguing over who was demoted, who had been insulted, who deserved to sit closer to the royal family, and why the Duchess of Harrowfield's cousin had a cushion and they did not. Seating charts became battlegrounds, each assignment a political landmine. Physical sabotage of the wedding environment was also popular. Decorations collapsed unexpectedly. A tapestry depicting the union of 2 royal houses was subtly altered so the bride's house appeared smaller and subservient. A saboteur tampered with the ventilation flues in the cathedral so that incense funneled directly toward the groom section. He sneezed through half the vows, which his enemies gleefully interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Sometimes sabotage unfolded boldly, openly. One bold faction marched into the ceremony carrying banners declaring that the marriage was illegitimate. Guards rushed to restrain them. The ceremony continued in awkward silence. Later at the feast, no one could decide whether to bring it up or pretend it hadn't happened. And worst of all, at some weddings, saboteurs tried to stop the marriage entirely. Bribes were offered, roads were blocked, horses were borrowed, priests were mysteriously delayed. Yet despite everything, the weddings happened. Mostly, but sabotage didn't always ruin weddings. Often it simply added layers of gossip, scandal and dramatic tension, enough to keep the court entertained for years. Royal weddings were dangerous stages where political ambition met romance and daggers hid behind bouquets. Because for every couple saying "I do," there were rivals whispering "I wish you wouldn't." Riots, scandals, annulments, runaway spouses, the chaos that unfolded once the last piece of cake was eaten. When happily ever after lasted about 6 hours. Royal weddings were supposed to end neatly, the bride and groom waved to the crowd, the guests head home full of wine and questionable opinions, and the kingdom sighs in relief knowing that peace, heirs, and stability are theoretically on the horizon. But some weddings had aftermath so chaotic, so dramatic, and so catastrophically messy that the ceremony turned out to be the calmest part of the entire affair. Because sometimes happily ever after lasted about 6 hours. Wild aftermaths happened for one simple reason. Royal weddings pulled together enormous crowds, enormous egos, and enormous expectations. When all 3 collided, things tended to explode, figuratively, sometimes literally. Let's begin with the most dramatic: riots. Royal weddings were public events. People travelled long distances to witness the spectacle, cheer for the bride, complain about taxes, or simply hover around the banquet tents to see if scraps fell from the tables. And sometimes the crowd got restless. At one wedding, thousands of citizens gathered to watch the royal procession, only to realise that the royal family had taken a private route to avoid them. Insulted, the crowd began hurling stale bread at the guards. The guards reacted poorly. Tensions escalated. By sundown, the city square looked less like a wedding celebration and more like a medieval street fight sponsored by rage and carbohydrates. Another wedding ended with a full-scale brawl in the streets when taverns offered free drinks in honour of the royal union. Free drinks always sound like a good idea, until half the city is drunk enough to forget why they were celebrating and decides to settle scores with their neighbours. People woke the next day with bruises, no memory of the fight, and a strong belief that the royal couple should never marry anyone again. Sometimes the aftermath chaos came from the guests, not the public. One royal feast evolved into a scandalous disaster when 2 high-ranking nobles slipped away from the celebrations and were discovered in an intimate situation that was not appropriate for the family trees involved. The scandal spread so quickly that songs were written about it before the cake was even cut. The union was supposed to symbolise peace, Instead, it symbolised tabloid material for the next century. Other aftermaths involved political meltdowns, which were practically a hobby among royal courts. Treaties signed during the celebrations were sometimes undone mere hours afterward. In one kingdom, a wedding designed to unite two factions ended with those same factions screaming at each other in the Great Hall because someone accused someone else of clapping too sarcastically during the vows. By morning, the fragile alliance had shattered, and the royal couple found themselves married into a conflict hotter than the candles that had nearly set their altar on fire. There were also the royal couples who discovered that newlywed bliss was more like newlywed panic. Some spouses ran away, literally, by morning. One groom fled the palace before sunrise, leaving a note that reportedly read, "I cannot do this." The bride, unsurprisingly, woke up furious. The kingdom woke up confused. Historians woke up grateful for the material. Another bride escaped through a side gate the night after her wedding, aided by a sympathetic lady-in-waiting and a horse with excellent nighttime galloping skills. She rode to a convent and declared she preferred the company of nuns to her new husband, which was not the endorsement he had hoped for. The king threatened to drag her back. The convent threatened divine wrath. The marriage lasted longer than the ceremony, but only barely. Some aftermaths spiraled into full annulments, especially when spouses discovered things they didn't like, such as political betrayals, conflicting personalities, or, in one spectacular case, the realization that the groom's portrait had been heavily edited and bore only partial resemblance to his actual face. The bride requested annulment on the grounds of unmet expectations. The court tried to pretend this was a legitimate legal argument. Shockingly, it worked. Other marriages technically survived but became instant dumpster fires. One couple began arguing so loudly on the wedding night that the guards outside their chamber debated whether to intervene or pretend they heard nothing. By the next day, the queen had moved into her own wing of the palace for personal reasons, and the king insisted he was perfectly content eating breakfast alone while staring gloomily at his ceremonial sword. Then there were the scandals that erupted as soon as the wine wore off. Guests spread gossip faster than wildfire in dry brush. Someone always overheard something they shouldn't. One aftermath became legendary because a foreign ambassador drunkenly confessed to spying loudly during the wedding feast. His confession caused such diplomatic chaos that two countries nearly went to war. The bride later wrote in her diary, "Next time I want a small private ceremony." Some chaos came from the simplest sources: bad luck and worse timing. At one wedding, the palace roof partially collapsed during the couple's first morning as newlyweds. No one was injured, but the symbolic message was unfortunate. In another kingdom, a fire broke out in the kitchen the morning after the celebration, destroying half the stored food and forcing the royal couple to spend their day receiving apologetic nobles instead of enjoying marital peace. And of course, there were the financial aftermaths. Some royal weddings were so extravagant that the kingdom woke up broke. Taxes increased, citizens grumbled, nobles complained about unnecessary excess. The groom, newly crowned, discovered he had married both his bride and in a massive national debt. Happily ever after became economically challenging ever after. Yet through all the chaos, riots, scandals, political implosions, runaway spouses, and public humiliation, royal weddings endured as iconic events. They were spectacles that revealed the fragile balance between power and pageantry, between politics and romance, between expectation and reality. Because if there is one truth about royal weddings, it's this: the ceremony might be staged, the rituals might be perfect, the symbolism might be majestic, but the aftermath, that was where the real story began. End with the marriages that reshaped dynasties, ruined alliances, toppled thrones, or set the stage for national disasters. These were the weddings the historians retell with the tone of a parent saying, "This is why we can't have nice things." Royal weddings didn't just unite people, they united nations, economies, armies, egos, and entire diplomatic ecosystems. A well-matched royal couple could stabilize a region. A poorly matched one could destabilize half a continent. And some marriages were so catastrophically influential that historians discuss them with the exasperated tone of a parent reviewing a shattered vase. This is why we can't have nice things. These weddings didn't just go wrong in amusing ways. They went wrong in ways that echoed for decades, sometimes centuries, shaping wars, rebellions, succession crises, and national disasters. These were the unions that altered the course of history for the worst. Let's begin with one of history's favourite catalysts for chaos: marriages that produced rival claims to crowns. Royal unions often blended bloodlines so thoroughly that future heirs ended up with claims to multiple thrones. Good for bragging rights, disastrous for geopolitics. One such wedding created an heir who legally had a right to 2 neighbouring kingdoms. The problem? Both kingdoms absolutely refused to share him. So the moment he was born, the legal debates began. Then the arguments, then the threats, then the armies. The baby had barely learned to sit upright, and he already had 2 nations fighting over which throne his tiny bottom should occupy. Other marriages triggered disaster because they united feuding houses under the astonishing assumption that marriage would fix everything. Spoiler, it did not. In one kingdom, a royal wedding attempted to merge 2 noble factions whose rivalry made family reunions look like battleground reenactments. The wedding day went smoothly enough. Nobody drew a weapon, which was considered a miracle, but the aftermath imploded spectacularly. Both factions demanded more influence, more titles, more land. Tensions escalated until a rebellion broke out. The marriage intended to bring unity instead delivered a civil war that lasted longer than the couple's relationship. Some royal weddings brought ruin because one spouse turned out to be an absolute political grenade. One queen married into a dynasty expecting a quiet life of diplomacy and inheritance. Instead, she arrived with such strong opinions, such intense ambition, and such a talent for accidentally insulting powerful nobles that the court split into factions within weeks. Her husband adored her, his advisors did not. Rumours spread that she manipulated policy. She claimed she merely had thoughts. Those thoughts triggered a series of reforms, counter-reforms, and retaliations that destabilized the realm. She married the kingdom, one chronicler wrote, and then rearranged the furniture so aggressively the kingdom fell over. Some weddings triggered financial catastrophe. Not the fun, one-night bankruptcies covered in earlier chapters, but long-term generational ruin. One king spent so lavishly on his wedding, imported spices, gold leaf decorations, enough silk to wrap the palace twice over, that the treasury never recovered. Taxes soared, farmers revolted, merchants complained. The king insisted it was a necessary display of power. His subjects insisted on storming several government buildings. The wedding became the spark in a dry political forest. Other royal unions brought disaster simply because the bride or groom came from the wrong foreign power. Marriages were supposed to create alliances, but if the alliance was unpopular, it could ignite national paranoia. When one king married a princess from a rival empire, the people panicked. She'll spy for her homeland. She'll influence our customs. She'll poison the royal children. The princess did none of these things. She mostly embroidered and tried to stay out of trouble. But public suspicion grew so intense that riots broke out any time she appeared in public. To restore order, the king cracked down. His crackdown angered the nobles. The nobles rebelled. The couple's marriage, intended to unite kingdoms, instead tore one apart from the inside. Perhaps the most disastrous royal weddings were the ones that placed wildly unqualified people into positions of power. One prince married a foreign bride with no understanding of the local politics. The court underestimated her, she underestimated the court. This created a perfect storm of miscommunication. She offended a major religious faction. She offended an influential noble household. She offended the ambassador of a neighbouring kingdom by complimenting his horse too enthusiastically, which apparently had diplomatic implications. The court descended into chaos. The marriage changed the kingdom, but not for the better. And then there were royal weddings that brought catastrophe through pure misfortune. One couple's union was meant to stabilise succession during a tense period. Then their firstborn died suddenly. Their second child developed an illness. Their third was kidnapped during a border conflict. This tragic series of events plunged the kingdom into panic about the future. Rival claimants rose, factions fought, and soon the royal line fractured into splintered pieces. Chroniclers later noted that the marriage, although filled with genuine affection, inadvertently ushered in an era of instability remembered as the century where everything fell apart. Perhaps the most infamous disastrous weddings involved spouses who despised each other but were forced to stay together for political reasons. One royal couple's mutual hatred escalated into public spectacle. Arguments in hallways, icy glares during festivals, and passive-aggressive seating arrangements at every feast. Their feud divided the court, with half supporting the bride, half supporting the groom, and everyone else desperately trying to avoid taking sides. Eventually, the tension provoked a full governmental collapse when both factions attempted coups at the same time. The marriage turned into a political demolition derby. But worst of all were the weddings that triggered international conflict. One royal marriage created an alliance so threatening to neighbouring kingdoms that panic spread across Europe. Neighbouring rulers formed counter-alliances. They raised armies. They launched preemptive strikes in the interest of balance. The result was a regional war that lasted years, cost thousands of lives, and accomplished nothing except making sure historians would complain about that wedding forever. And through it all, one truth emerges. Royal weddings were never just personal milestones. They were strategic gambles with enormous stakes. Their success could create golden ages. Their failure could shatter nations. These were the weddings that shaped destinies, not with romance, but with unintended consequences, not with unity, but with fallout, not with happily ever after, but with historical catastrophe ahead. And as historians recount these marriages, whether with awe, pity, or exasperation, they do so in that unmistakable parental tone. This, they sigh, shaking their heads at the pages of history, is why we can't have nice things.